told me I came to him with only one. They sent me away to die. They had no idea what was waiting for me.
The audience hall was the color of cold gold, every surface polished, every banner pulled taut, every dignitary positioned exactly where protocol required. At the back of the hall, in the row of researchers and minor functionaries, Alice Brick was fighting a war against her own eyelids and losing. She had not slept. There had been a notation in a 500-year-old magic book on a page she had been told not to expect to be interesting, and the notation had argued with itself in a way Alice had not seen before. By the time she looked up from the table, the candles in her lab had burned down, and the palace messenger was already at her door. So now she was here, standing, trying to remember how to be a person at a ceremony. A young knight with bright blonde hair leaned slightly toward her from her left. Theodore. He had insisted on accompanying her this morning, the way he had insisted on bringing his magic sword to her for maintenance every few weeks for the past 2 years. Alice, his voice was low. Please don't fall asleep. I'm awake. You closed your eyes for 9 seconds. I was thinking, with your eyes closed, it is more efficient. He made a small sound that was almost a laugh, then squared his shoulders again. The chancellor at the front of the hall raised his ceremonial scroll, and the room hushed in that particular way that rooms hush when royalty are about to speak. What none of the people in that room knew, including Alice herself, was that this small woman fighting sleep at the back of the hall would, in time, become something the people on the throne would spend years trying and failing to undo. Researcher Alice Brick. The chancellor's voice was thin and important. Step forward, she did, small, in her only formal dress, pale blue, plain. The kind of dress a researcher buys because she once needed to attend a colleague's funeral and never thought she would need it again. She walked the length of the marble carpet, and her shoes made the smallest possible sound against the stone, and she knelt where she was supposed to kneel. The chancellor read out the proclamation. Wide area barrier magic, developed in collaboration with the late director Victor of the Royal Magic Research Institute, a feat previously considered impossible. The kingdom owed her thanks. She kept her eyes on the carpet. She thought briefly about the page that had argued with itself. Researcher Alice Brick, said the king, and his voice was a stone dropping into still water. You have served the kingdom well. We grant you a reward. The chancellor read the reward. The territory of Valmore, the borderlands, the demon forest, to be governed as its lord, by Alice Brick, by the king's authority, effective immediately. A small ripple moved through the hall. One person's sharp breath, multiplied by 200. Alice's spine recognized it before her mind did. She thought it through. Valmore was not money. Valmore was not research funds. Valmore was a forest with monsters and no infrastructure, and her work was ancient magic notation, and a forest could not help her with that. She raised her head, very politely. I do not really need a territory, she said, and felt the hall go still. Could you make it money instead? Or research funds? I would use it for research anyway. Increasing the research budget would be fine too. There was a moment in which nothing happened. Then several things happened at once, but none of them were sounds. The chancellor's scroll slipped out of his hand and made a small, embarrassed noise against the marble. The queen's fan, which had been resting open in her lap, snapped shut. Somewhere, a dignitary inhaled a breath he then could not figure out how to release. The king looked at Alice. His eyes held no anger. They held the careful, level interest of a man who has just discovered an animal in a place no animal should be. Alice waited for an answer. She was not afraid. She was confused. The territory was clearly impractical, and she had clearly explained why. She did not yet understand that a court does not respond to clarity. A court responds to rank. The story turns now to the day that had set the ceremony in motion. To do that, it goes back 1 month into the place Alice belonged. The Royal Magic Research Institute's ancient circle laboratory was, by any reasonable measure, a fire hazard. 500-year-old books stood in 3 uneven stacks against one wall. Notation papers, copies, drafts, abandoned attempts were layered across every available surface. A small magical brazier glowed gold in the corner. A water basin and a quill pen and a small box of monster feather ink completed the place where Alice spent most of her waking hours, and a fair number of her sleeping ones. She was sitting cross-legged on her chair, hunched over an open volume, tracing a circle's outer boundary with her finger half an inch above the page. She was not touching it. She had learned not to touch it. The door opened. She did not look up. Royal correspondence for researcher Alice Brick. The voice belonged to a palace official whose entire posture suggested he was offended by the lab's existence on principle. Alice raised one hand without looking up and made a small gesture meant to convey, "Set it down anywhere." The official's expression went through several silent stages of judgment before he placed the envelope on the only clean corner of her desk and left. Alice finished the line she was on, set down her finger, and looked at the envelope, the royal seal, the kingdom's wax, the kind of letter people put in display cases. She broke the seal with her thumb and read it twice. The second time was not because she was confused, it was because she hoped the first reading had been wrong. Decoration ceremony, royal audience hall, her presence required. She sighed the sigh of a person who would rather be doing literally anything else. She placed the envelope under a paperweight shaped like a cat and returned her finger to the line in the magic circle. 3 hours later, the door opened again, and this time Alice did look up. The sound of the door's hinge had a shape she recognized, slower, more careful than the officials had been. She knew before she saw him that it was Theodore. He stepped inside, took in the chaos, and smiled the smile of a man who had been having this same thought every couple of weeks for 2 years. "As usual," he said. "An extraordinary room. It is fairly tidy, actually." "By whose standards?" "Mine." He let the question lie. He was carrying his magic sword at the slight protective angle he always used when the inscription needed work. She held out her hand. He drew the sword and laid it across her workbench, then began moving abandoned notation papers into a small organized pile while she worked. He had a system. He did not ask where things went. Alice unstoppered the magic ink and began refilling the inscription on the sword's circle, each line measured. The work took time the same way poetry did. Toward the end, when the gold inscription was newly bright and the ink stains on her fingers had reached her knuckles, he signed the maintenance order on the desk and watched her finish. Then, in the casual voice people use when they are about to say something carefully, "I heard about the ceremony." She kept her eyes on the sword. "It is a hassle. It is the king's order. It is still a hassle." He waited a moment, then quieter. Director Victor would have been happy. She stopped moving. She did not say anything for a long time. She stoppered the ink. She set down the pen. The afternoon light moved 1/2 inch across the workbench. Then she nodded, once. "Maybe I will go," she said. Maybe. Theodore had known what mentioning Victor would do. He had done it anyway. He left a few minutes later. Alice stayed where she was. The afternoon light moved another 1/2 inch. Because once you have heard the word Victor, the rest of the lab becomes a different room. Alice had been 6 years old when he found her. The memory came back in pieces, never quite in order. A snowy alley, a girl with no family, and a hunger she had stopped naming. A man with gray hair and round wire-framed glasses, kneeling so his face was at her height, holding a small piece of bread out, as if he were handing her a question rather than food. He had asked her name. She had told him. He had asked her if she would like to see something interesting. She had said yes, because she was 6, and the bread was real. What he had shown her was a water ball magic circle. He had drawn it on the wall of the alley with his finger, slowly, line by line, narrating each curve as if it mattered that she understood. When the circle activated, a small sphere of water hovered in the cold air between them and caught the streetlight. And Alice, who had not had a reason to be impressed by anything in some time, had decided in that moment that she was going to spend the rest of her life understanding how that worked. She had entered the Royal Magic Research Institute at the age of 12. He had signed the papers as her adoptive father by then. He had not asked her to call him father. She had called him director, the way the rest of the institute did, and he had let her. He had taught her notation the way a parent teaches a child to swim, by deciding she could do it and standing close enough to catch her. He had also taught her how to keep promises. "I want you to be trusted," he had said once, with the small frown he reserved for things that mattered. "Keep your promises. See them through." She had been 15 when he first proposed the wide area barrier magic. He had spoken about it differently from how he spoke about other research, as if it were not curiosity, but obligation. His homeland had been burned in a war before Alice was born. He did not say he wanted to be remembered for it. He said he wanted it to exist. Then a duke's daughter named Janet Ferguson became his apprentice. She was the niece of the queen, and she required tutoring at hours that were her own and not his. He had not been able to refuse. Alice had researched alone for 2 years, 2 years in which Victor came to the lab less and less, looked tired in a way she did not have the language for, and began to leave instructions on his desk for the days he was absent. He had died of an epidemic. That was what the papers said. An illness moved through the capital, and it took several people, and one of them was a man with gray hair and round glasses who had been trying to do too many things for too long with not enough rest. Alice had stood at his bedside on the last day and had not cried until afterward. After that, she had finished the research, alone. The notation that he and she had been building together, she had completed it. She had submitted the paper to the institute, and on the cover page she had written Director Victor as the lead researcher and herself as assistant. instant. It was not modesty. It was the truth of how the work had begun, and the truth of who had taught her every line of notation that had made it possible. It was also, she did not yet know, the smallest opening that another person would soon walk through. The afternoon in the lab was over. Theodore had gone. The maintenance order was on the desk. The sword was sheathed. She sat with her hands wrapped around her teacup, which had gone cold, and thought about a man with round glasses who would have wanted her to attend a ceremony she did not want to attend. She decided to go. The story returns now to the moment after Alice had asked the king for money. The hall had not yet decided what to do with what she had said. The chancellor was still trying to recover his scroll without bending too obviously. The queen's fan had not reopened. The king had not yet spoken. Then, from the row of nobles closest to the throne, a young woman stepped forward. She was wearing a white researcher's outer robe, a uniform Alice recognized because she had one of her own hanging in the institute closet. But the dress beneath it was deep purple silk, and the makeup on her face was a more deliberate art than anyone else in the hall. Janet Ferguson, the queen's niece, the Duke of Ferguson's daughter. The young woman director Victor had spent his last 2 years tutoring at hours that were not his. Janet curtsied to the king and queen with practiced ease, and then she addressed the hall in a voice that was warmer than it should have been, because she wanted everyone to hear her clearly. She apologized for the interruption. She introduced herself by full title. She said she had been a researcher at the Magic Research Institute for the past 2 years. She said she had been Director Victor's disciple, in the close way that disciples were, and as such, she said, the wide area barrier magic had been primarily the work of Director Victor and herself, his student. Researcher Alice, she allowed, had been an early member of the project and had played an important role, but ultimately, she said, with the careful kindness of a woman dispensing a smaller portion of a thing than was deserved, an assistant. So if researcher Alice were to leave the institute and become the Lord of Valmore, the research would continue without difficulty. She bowed slightly. She smiled, a small triumphant smile that did not reach her eyes, and returned to her place beside the throne. The hall accepted it. Alice could feel the acceptance happen. The whisper that had been moving through the dignitaries at the back resolved itself into a more comfortable shape. Ah, of course, the noble lady had been the real researcher all along. Alice did not move from where she was kneeling. She thought it through, the way she thought through everything. She had every notation she and Victor had ever built together memorized. She knew when Janet had visited the lab. Never. She knew when Janet had done research. Never. She knew that Victor had spent his last 2 years being summoned to Janet's house at Janet's hours, and had come back exhausted, and had eventually come back ill, and had eventually not come back at all. She could expose this. She had the knowledge. But if she spoke now, the fight would be public, and it would center on Director Victor's reputation. His name would land in a contested file in the Royal Archive, where future researchers would find a footnote saying authorship disputed. That was the future Alice could not give him. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She opened them. She bowed her head to the king. The king's voice rolled back through the hall. Researcher Alice Brick was to depart the institute and head to Valmore territory immediately. The continuation of wide area barrier magic research would, from this day forward, fall to researcher Janet Ferguson. The queen, smiling with eyes that had narrowed in pleasure, mentioned almost as an afterthought that there was, fortunately, a castle in the Valmore forest where Alice could take up residence. Alice accepted the order. She bowed deeply. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her formal dress, were closed into fists. She said the formal acknowledgement without hearing herself say it. The chancellor placed a small object in her palm, a heavy gold ring, the seal of Valmore territory, the Lord's ring, and she closed her fingers around it. She thought very clearly, I will not cooperate with these people. Not now, not ever. Not the king, not the queen, not Janet, not the court that watched. They will not have me again. She did not say it out loud. She turned and walked the length of the marble carpet back the way she had come, and Theodore fell into step beside her at the back of the hall, and the ceremony continued without her as if she had been a piece of bookkeeping. The corridor outside the audience hall was long enough that she had time to feel the ring's weight settle into her hand. Theodore walked beside her without speaking. He had seen Janet step forward, and he had seen Alice not speak. And he knew the difference between not speaking because there was nothing to say and not speaking because there was too much. The far end of the corridor opened onto the palace's outer courtyard. Beyond that, the city. Beyond that, eventually, a forest with monsters in it, and a castle no one had told her was abandoned. She would learn that part later. For now, the ring. She lifted her hand and looked at it. Heavy gold. The seal of Valmore, a stylized tree above a crossed sword and pen, pressed deep into the ring's face. The kind of object designed to feel important. She slid it onto her right index finger because it would not fit any other. It was too big. Theodore glanced at it. He did not say anything. Alice walked. She was not crying. She had cried for Victor years ago. She had cried in private, and then she had finished his work. And crying for what had just been done to that work would have been a thing he would have called wasted hours. What she did instead, as the corridor opened onto the courtyard and the hard mid-morning light hit her in the face, was make a list. Inside, not out loud. She would go to Valmore. She had been ordered to, and refusing was no longer in the room with her. She would take her notation books. She would take whatever instruments she could carry. She would write nothing for the Institute that she did not have to. If a request came from the capital, she would handle it the way one handles correspondence one is required to acknowledge, but not required to honor. If the king's officials came looking for the wide area barrier magic in any form Alice could withhold, they would not find it. That was not a vow. It was an inventory. She did not know that the territory she was being sent to was a hiding place for people the kingdom had also thrown away. She did not know that what she had built with Director Victor could not actually be replicated by anyone who had not understood what it was. What she knew was that the ring on her finger was too big and the morning was too bright. The palace gate opened ahead of them. Outside, the carriage was already waiting. The audience for this story knows what Alice does not. The Kingdom of Gazin has just made a small bookkeeping decision about a sleepy researcher who asked them for the wrong thing. Nothing about that decision will hold. Not the territory, not the exile, not the credit, not the silence. Every single piece of what just happened in that hall will, in time, come back to the people who arranged it. Everyone. The carriage rolled out of the palace courtyard at the appointed hour. In the audience hall behind her, Janet Ferguson smiled at the king. In the Institute's lab, an empty chair waited. In the territory of Valmore, in a forest no one had returned from in 15 years, a woman with gray eyes and a sword was watching the road and counting the days until the next full moon. None of them yet knew about each other. 4 days after the ceremony, Alice was in a carriage she had not asked for, on a road that was taking her somewhere she had not asked to go. She had circles under her eyes, the color of bruised plums. The last 3 days had been spent packing. Her notation books, her ink, her measuring instruments, the small magical brazier she could not bear to leave behind, a single folded copy of the wide area barrier paper she had filed under Victor's name. The other researchers at the Institute had helped her. They had been visibly surprised by the speed of the order. They had agreed to store the rest of her belongings in the Institute's basement until she could come back for them. Some of them had said this gently, as if not certain she would. The carriage hit a rut. Alice's notation book slid off her lap and onto the floor. She did not pick it up. She closed her eyes for a moment and let her head rest against the wooden frame and tried to remember what the lab had smelled like. She thought briefly about Camille. Camille was a thin man with a thin voice and a smile that arrived a half second after he had decided to use it. He had Alice's Lord contract on his desk and a Lord's ring in a small velvet box, and exactly the amount of patience required to read both items aloud and no more. She had asked for time to wrap up her research and prepare a proper handover. He had laughed, the kind of laugh that meant the answer was no before any reasoning attached itself. Researcher Alice. His voice had the bright edge of a person enjoying himself. He had explained, with all due respect, that he was aware she had not really been doing her job. The new director, Lady Janet, had reported as much. Alice should be transferred quickly before any further research was, as Lady Janet had put it, stolen. Alice had said very politely that Lady Janet rarely came to the Institute and could not possibly know what Alice did all day. Camille had smiled and asked her, with the same brightness, to provide evidence. She had no evidence. Evidence would have been a registry of who came and went from the lab, and the Institute did not keep one. She closed her mouth and nodded. He had handed her the ring with both hands, like he was bestowing it. Don't lose it. This is the proof of your lordship. 3 days. The Lord's ring. A signature she had given because the alternative was an argument she had already lost. The flashback closed the way memories close. Gradually, then all at once. In the capital that morning, the queen was having tea. The room was small in the way that important rooms are small. Every surface deliberate, every flower fresh, every cup placed exactly where the queen's hand expected it to be. Through the open window came the rhythmic sound of a wooden practice sword striking a wooden post. Her son Cedric, 12 years old, was practicing in the courtyard below. He moved with the stiff seriousness of a boy who had not yet learned that being a prince was a tone of voice rather than an act of will. The queen watched him through the window without watching him, the way a person watches a candle they do not need to keep lit. Her butler stood beside her chair and waited until she had taken her first sip of tea before speaking. The director appointment had been finalized. Lady Janet was settled into the position. There were no problems. The other matter, the magic researcher and the senior knight, had been resolved as well. They had departed the capital that morning, heading directly to Valmore territory. National defense had been cited as the reason. From a national defense perspective, the butler murmured, it was a perfectly natural consideration. The queen smiled. The queen said, in the tone of someone closing a small file, that she hoped the researcher did well. She added, with the casual precision of a woman accustomed to having her preferences understood, that the researcher had been Victor's lackey, and lackeys of Victor could not be permitted to live on indefinitely. The butler bowed. The queen stood up. Her son was practicing the high stance again. She watched him strike the post twice more, then turned and left the tea room with her maids, the matter of the magic researcher already gone from her thoughts as if it had never required them. At the same moment, in another building, Janet Ferguson sat in the director's chair. She had not changed anything in the office yet. The bookshelves still held Victor's books in the order Victor had placed them. The desk still held Victor's brass paperweight and Victor's inkwell. She had simply seated herself behind the desk and folded her hands on the polished wood and looked across the room at the chair where Victor had used to sit. She picked up the published wide area barrier paper from the corner of the desk. The cover page bore Director Victor as lead researcher and researcher Alice Brick as assistant. She read it. She did not understand most of what she read. The notation was unlike anything she had seen at school, where her attack magic results had made her the strongest student in her year. She could see that the paper described something extraordinary. She could not see how it had been built. That was a problem for tomorrow. For today, she smiled at the empty chair. Then she picked up a quill and signed her first official notice as director. 3 days of road and one small town later, the carriage stopped. The other 3 knights of the escort took their leave at the inn. Their orders had ended at the kingdom's last properly governed town. Theodore stayed. Alice sat across from him at the inn's wooden table and ate stew that had a great many vegetables and exactly enough salt. The fire in the hearth threw lazy orange light. They were the only 2 travelers in the room. Theodore unfolded a map between them and put his finger on a point a half-day's wagon ride away, Casre Village, the closest settlement to the Demon Forest. He had arranged for the village's chief to meet them in the morning. Then, in the careful voice he used when he was about to ask a question with more weight than its surface suggested. For safety, he said, I want to confirm something. Can you use attack magic? She looked up from her stew. No. You have never used it? It is outside my specialty. He nodded slowly. He looked at the map again, but he was not really looking at the map. The dark expression Alice had been noticing for 2 days surfaced for a moment and then was tucked back under his composure. He folded the map and slid it across the table to her, and they ate the rest of the meal in a quiet that was not awkward but was not comfortable either. The next morning, the wagon arrived. The driver was a sturdy man in his 50s, with sun-darkened hands and the precise care of a person who has spent his life moving things that did not belong to him. He introduced himself as the chief of Casre Village. He had been told to expect a new lord. He had not been told the new lord would be small and tired-looking and around 20. He was extremely careful not to comment on this. The wagon rolled out toward the village. The road thinned and the trees grew taller on either side. Alice watched the landscape change and thought about what she had read in the Institute library. 90% of Valmore territory was Demon Forest, and somewhere inside the forest stood a castle reported by the explorer Bart 15 years ago, and that was the entirety of the official record. She asked the chief conversationally about the previous lord. The chief was quiet for a moment. He drove the wagon with one hand and rubbed his beard with the other. Then he answered, with a small embarrassment that was clearly not meant for her. The previous lord, miss. There has not been one. As far as I know, you are the first. Alice processed this. Then she said the thought out loud before she had thought about saying it. So, I am unnecessary, aren't I? A crow somewhere in the canopy gave a short caw. It sounded, in the precise way that crows sometimes sound, like agreement. Theodore looked at her sideways. He did not laugh. He came close. Cosray Village was poor. The crops in the strip fields outside the village were thin in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The houses were small stone cottages with thatched roofs that had been patched and repatched. The children watched Alice and Theodore with the cautious curiosity of children who did not see strangers often. The chief's wife and his daughter, Lotta, met them at the chief's house. The wife warm and brisk, Lotta shy and visibly nervous, the kind of nervous that turned into a small blush when Theodore thanked her for the guest house key. Dinner was meat and bean soup, fresh bread, a salad. The wife had clearly been preparing all afternoon. Alice ate carefully and complimented the soup and meant it, and the wife beamed. And for a few minutes, the room was full of the small, quiet warmth of a household that had decided to do its best for its visitors. Then Alice asked, as casually as she could manage, where the castle in the forest was. The chief stopped chewing. His wife stopped serving. Lotta glanced quickly at her father, then at the floor, then somewhere safe in the middle distance. The chief set his spoon down with the deliberate care of a man who has just been asked to step onto a frozen pond and is choosing his footing. The castle, you say? His voice went a half step lower. Yes, there is one. He did not say anything else for a long moment. The dishes were cleared. Lotta had been sent to bed. The chief's wife poured tea with hands that were steadier than her face. The chief told them what he knew. 15 years ago, the explorer Bart had led a party of 20 adventurers into the demon forest to investigate the castle. The party had not come back. Bart had, alone, injured, and only barely. He had reported what he had seen to the capital and then left the village within a few days. After he was gone, the capital had sent officials. The officials had told the village very plainly that the expedition was not to be spoken of. They had used the word hanging. Anyone who told the story would be hanged. The village had not told the story for 15 years. The chief was telling Alice now because Alice had a lord's ring and because the question deserved an answer. The chief's wife reached out and put her hand on Alice's wrist. She told her, with the soft firmness of someone who had decided not to be tactful, that she should not go. Theodore set his teacup down. In the careful voice from the inn, he proposed a plan. He would go alone tomorrow. He would scout the forest, find the castle, return with a report. Alice should remain in the village. He did not look at her while he said this. Alice listened. She watched him not look at her. She thought about the dark expression that had been visiting his face for the last 3 days. And she thought about the question he had asked her at the inn. And she thought about the way a person who is about to do something dangerous tries to leave the people he cares about somewhere safer first. She had seen director Victor do this. He had done it the year before he died. She set her teacup down carefully. Then, in the simplest voice she had, "No," she said. "We go together." Theodore looked up at her at last. He did not argue. He did not have a real argument to make, and they both knew it. After a moment, he agreed to a compromise. They would explore the shallow part of the forest first, together. Whatever came after, they would decide after. The chief and his wife exchanged the look of two people who had just realized that nothing they said would change the outcome. Outside, somewhere over the dark line of trees, the demon forest was quiet. In the capital, an empty institute chair faced an empty desk. In the queen's tea room, a tea service had been cleared. In a forest none of them had seen, behind a barrier none of them yet knew about, a child with a rabbit plushie was already asleep. None of them had heard of each other yet. The morning was thin and gray. The chief and his wife saw them off at the edge of the village, carrying lanterns that did not really need to be lit anymore. Lotta stood a half step behind her parents and held out a cloth-wrapped bundle to Alice with both hands, a lunchbox. The girl's voice trembled. Alice took it carefully and thanked her, and Lotta's face flushed pink and she stepped back. The chief warned them, one final time, not to go too far in. He told them about a stone hut at the forest's edge, built years ago by the explorer Bart, and now kept by the village. The hut was the boundary. Beyond it, the trees changed. Alice and Theodore walked. The dirt path narrowed into the trees. Above them, the canopy closed. The change in the air came before the change in the light. Alice felt it on her skin. The magic in the forest was thicker than the magic outside it, the way humid air is heavier than dry. By the time they reached the stone hut, she had stopped talking because her attention had been entirely consumed by the texture of the place. Theodore noticed. He said nothing. They went past the hut, into the dense forest, looking for the path that the explorer had once described. The further in they walked, the larger the trees became. Eventually, the path disappeared and they were navigating by Theodore's compass and Alice's instinct for which way the magic ran heavier. They reached a clearing with a single enormous tree at its center, bigger across than any tree Alice had ever seen, and there they stopped to refill their canteens. Alice cut a strip of magic paper, drew a small water sphere circle on it, and produced enough clean water to fill both canteens. Magic paper, she explained when Theodore raised an eyebrow, was good for 2 hours, or 2 or 3 uses, whichever came first. After that, the notation faded. She had built this particular circle so often, she could draw it without thinking. They started walking again. They found nothing. No castle, no path, just deeper trees and denser air. Alice was beginning to suggest they double back when Theodore stopped walking. He was looking at a patch of air 30 yards to their left, the way one looks at the surface of a pond when something has just disturbed it from below. "Stop," he said quietly. Alice stopped. The air changed. Alice did not have time to ask what he meant. The first wolf came out of the bushes faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It was black. It was the size of a large dog and shaped like a wrong dog, its proportions slightly off, its eyes too bright, its mouth open in a way that was not meant for breathing. It came from the side, low and silent, and it was already in the air when Theodore's sword left its scabbard. His sword cleared the strike in a single movement. The wolf made it halfway through the air and then in 2 pieces. Both halves hit the ground. The wound at the cut bloomed white with frost. Alice had not known until that moment that the inscription on his sword had ice properties, and the body steamed in the cool air. Theodore did not relax. He turned his shoulder toward the trees and lifted the sword again. "It called for the others," he said. "Stay behind me." Alice could not move her legs. She had read about combat freeze. She had read about the way the body refuses to obey orders when fear arrives faster than thought. She had not realized until this moment that knowing the name of a thing did not give you any defense against it. Her hands were cold. Her brain was working at full speed, and her body was doing nothing. Theodore looked back at her once. He did not waste time arguing. He sheathed his sword for 1 second, picked her up under his arm like a parcel of magic paper, and carried her at a run to the giant tree at the center of the clearing. He set her down with her back against the trunk, where the bark would protect her from anything coming from behind. Then he drew his sword again, took a stance at the edge of the trunk's shadow, and began to glow. A faint blue light moved up his arms and across his shoulders, a quiet aura that had no source she could see. Body enhancement, the kind of magic knights used to push their bodies past human limits for short bursts. He had never used it in front of her before. He had never needed to. The wolves came out of the trees in a loose ring. 6, then 8, then more behind them. Theodore began to fight. He moved the way a knife moves through water, quick and clean, and without any wasted action. 2 wolves down. 3. He was not going to lose. He was also not going to win, because the ring kept getting deeper, and a man who fights perfectly will still tire, and a man who tires against an unending pack will eventually stop. Alice's legs decided to work again. She took the magic paper from her satchel. She took the small scissors. She took the quill and the bottle of monster feather ink, and she set them in the dirt at her feet. She had practiced this notation, she realized, as she began to cut the paper, for a wholly stupid reason. 2 summers ago, she had wanted to make ice treats in the lab without going to the kitchen. She had built an ice spear array as a quick chilling tool and never quite finished refining it. The notation was still in her head. It had never occurred to her that she was building a weapon. She drew the circle on the cut paper in fast, certain strokes. She added the broadcast modifier, the small adjustment that made the array fire outward in a spread instead of a single point. She breathed in. She held the paper above her head with both hands. "Theodore," she called. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Step back." Theodore took 1 long step backward toward the tree. Behind the line her circle was about to define. Alice activated the circle. The air above her head filled with something that was not sound and not light, the kind of pressure without noise that magic made when it was about to commit. Then the spears came. 5 of them, 6 of them, 8 of them, each one the length of a man's forearm and the cold blue of deep ice, and they fell all at once on the ring of wolves. 5 wolves were impaled where they stood. Their bodies froze around the ice, the way water freezes around a stone dropped into it. The remaining wolves, the ones who had been crowding in behind, froze for a different reason. They saw their packmates suspended in the air, ice-locked, dead. They saw the small gray-eyed woman under the tree with paper in her hand. They turned and ran. The clearing went quiet. Alice's ears rang. She lowered her hands. "I did it," she said. "I did it." Theodore turned to look at her. He was breathing hard. The body enhancement light was already fading. He looked at the frozen wolves and at her, and at her again, and a small wry smile crossed his face. The smile of a man who has just realized he has been protecting someone who maybe did not need it. He sheathed his sword. "Yes," he said. "You did." 10 minutes after the last wolf fled, the rain began. By the time they reached the hut at the forest's edge, both of them were soaked through. Theodore stoked a fire in the small fireplace. Alice drew a small fire sphere circle on cut paper to light the kindling, and the wood caught with a satisfying crack. They dried in front of the fire. They ate the lunch Lotte had packed: black bread, hard cheese, 2 small apples. Alice complimented the bread. Theodore did not laugh at her, but the small smile from the clearing was still moving around his mouth in a different shape now. "That ice spear notation," he said carefully, sitting on the wooden bench across from her. "I have not seen anything like it, even from the Institute's senior researchers." She told him about the ice treats. He looked at her for a moment as if waiting for the rest of the answer. There was no rest. He laughed properly then, a real laugh, low and surprised. He told her that she was the only person he had ever met who could build a piece of military-grade magic by accident while trying to chill a pudding. She liked the laugh. It made the hut seem smaller and warmer. They sat in the firelight for a while, and she found herself asking him a question she had wondered about for 2 years. "Why did you become a knight?" He did not answer right away. Then, in the quiet voice he used when he was choosing his words, his grandfather had been an upper knight. The man had been gone several years now. Theodore had admired him very much. That was all. He did not embroider. The rain went on. They unfolded the map and looked at it. Alice did the math. They had walked into the forest for less than an hour and explored, what? Perhaps less than 1/100th of its area. The castle could be anywhere. They could spend a season looking for it and still miss it. She was about to suggest, gently, that they might consider going back to the village. Theodore beat her to a different proposal. "After we sleep here," he said, looking at the map and not at her, "let's return to the village. Then I will go to the castle, alone." Alice looked at him. The quiet in the hut sharpened. Outside, the rain went on with the steady indifference of weather that does not know what is happening inside. "Theodore," she said, "you have been acting strangely since the road. You think I have not noticed." He did not look up from the map. "You are hiding something." He did not answer. She watched him for a long moment. Then she let it go. She told him she was tired and that they could discuss it in the morning. She turned away from the fire and lay down on the bedroll with her back to him, and she pretended to fall asleep. And she did not. By the time Theodore actually slept, the fire was down to red embers, and the rain had thinned to a soft, steady patter. Alice sat up quietly. She crossed the room. She knelt beside him. His shirt had ridden up at the collar where he had pulled at it before lying down. Through the gap, she saw the top edge of something on the skin of his upper back, a mark, a line that was too clean and too dark to be a scar. She held her hand a few inches above his back and let her senses settle, the way she had been settling them on ancient notation pages for years. The mark on his back was a magic circle, a complex one. Her stomach went cold. She fetched her notation paper and her quill from the satchel and copied what she could see in the faint light, line by careful line. She did not touch his skin. She did not need to. The circle was not active right now. It was passive, waiting. She added the parts she could not see directly by reading the curvature and inferring the closure. The full notation took her 30 minutes to lay out on paper. When she finished, she sat back and read what she had built. It was a contract circle, the kind of thing that bound a person to a master or an institution, the kind of thing she had read about in old books and never expected to encounter on a living person. This particular one had 4 functions stitched together in nested layers. It tracked his location continuously. It contained an attack mechanism keyed to a remote authority, a thing that could be triggered to hurt him if the authority chose. It contained a forced enhancement function that could be made to override his self-control, and it bled mana from him slowly, all the time, in a way that would eventually wear his body down. She had analyzed enough of these designs in the Institute archive to recognize this one. Years ago, low-rank soldiers had been targeted by criminals selling fake strengthening tattoos, circles that promised power and delivered control instead. She had seen examples in the Institute's archive. This one was identical in family and superior in execution, but the same trick. Alice stared at the lines on her paper. She had a clear professional opinion about this kind of notation. The opinion was that it was damaged work. Damaged work on a person was a medical problem. She had been repairing magic notation on Theodore's sword for 2 years. That was repair work. This was repair work on a different surface. She slid the paper back into her satchel. She moved her own coat across his shoulders so the cool air would not wake him. She placed her hand a half-inch above the line at the top of his back and let her own magic settle into the room. Erasing a magic circle when you knew what you were doing was not difficult. It was easier than drawing one. The lines wanted to lie down given a chance. She read the shape and worked back through it, undoing each stitched layer in the order it had been built. She took her time. She wanted the erasure to be clean. It took her 10 minutes. When she was done, the skin under her hand was unmarked. She gathered the paper she had copied the notation onto, tossed it into the dying embers, and watched it curl into ash. Then she went back to her own bedroll and lay down with her back to the fire and slept. Alice woke to a sound she had never heard Theodore make. It was not quite a scream. It was the noise a person makes when they have just discovered that something they relied on without ever thinking about it was no longer there. He was standing in the corner of the hut, half undressed, holding a small travel mirror in one hand and angled to see his own back over his shoulder. The skin was clean. His face was the color of old paper. He saw her sit up. "It is gone," she nodded. "You did this." She nodded again. He came across the hut in 3 long strides, sat down very heavily on the bench across from her, and did not say anything for a long while. She watched him try to assemble a face. "Theodore," she said carefully, "I thought it was a fake. I thought it was... There were soldiers, years ago, who were sold notation like that as fake strengthening tattoos. I thought you had been tricked, and the design on your back had 4 bad properties stitched together, and I was not going to leave it on you. I am sorry I did not ask first." He listened. He let her finish. Then, in a voice that was very quiet, he told her what the notation actually was. It had been given to him at the palace, the day he was promoted to Upper Knight. Every Upper Knight received it. The kingdom called it a contract circle. It tracked them. It permitted certain forms of compulsion. It also signaled, by its disappearance, a single binary fact. The bearer was either dead or had committed treason. There was no third option. The court mages monitored the circles continuously. By the time this morning's reading went up, his absence in the registry would be a matter of formal record. By tonight, the kingdom would have an arrest warrant for him on charges of desertion. Erasing the circle yourself was a death penalty offense. It usually took a month and was excruciatingly painful, and people who tried it almost always died of the process. He had heard of one knight who had managed it and been caught at the border within 3 days and hanged on the spot. He had been planning, before yesterday, to escort Alice to the castle, fake their trip to look like an exploration, and use a quiet moment to send her north toward the Nortian Free State alone, using the tracking magic to bait the kingdom's attention onto himself instead of her. The plan had needed the circle to work. The plan was now over. Alice listened. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the ash from the paper she had burned the night before. She thought it through. "Then I will turn myself in," she said. "I will say I forced the erasure. You did not know. They will believe a researcher. We have done worse than this for less. You go back to the kingdom and I take it. There is nothing they can do to me that they have not already done." Theodore looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. That was all the answer he gave. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain-wet morning. He came back. He sat down again. And then he told her what he was going to do. They would go into the demon forest. The kingdom did not have the men to chase anyone into the deep forest. The forest was vast, large enough that 2 people who entered and did not come out would be assumed dead within a few weeks. Across it, on the other side, was the Nortian Free State. There were no checkpoints in the forest. They would walk for as many days as it took. It would take at least 10. They would survive. That was the whole plan. Alice nodded once. She did not argue. She had seen, in the way he had spoken, that he had already decided. She did not need to ask why he was choosing the forest path with her over the kingdom's certainty without her. She had spent 2 years watching him make smaller choices. She knew the shape. "Then we go," she said. He nodded. He turned away from the window and they began. Theodore went back to the village alone, retrieved a heavier pack from the wagon, and explained to the chief, quietly, briefly, that they would not be returning. The chief did not ask questions. He helped Theodore gather cold weather cloaks, dried meat, hard biscuits, salt, a tinder kit, a coil of strong cord. Theodore gave the chief a small bag of his own coin and asked him not to mention the visit to anyone from the capital. The chief said he had not mentioned visits from the capital for 15 years and saw no reason to start now. Theodore came back to the hut by mid-morning. Alice was on her knees in front of the door, drawing on cut paper with great speed. She had 3 magic circles laid out in front of her. He recognized one, the ice spear array from the day before. He did not recognize the other 2. She explained them as she worked. One was an offensive water spell, configured for area suppression. The other was a footprint erasure array, over 100 small water spheres, raining down at a controlled rate, rinsing the soil clean of any sign of passage. She activated the footprint array as they left. The rain rose around them in an unnatural pattern, 100 and some small spheres dropping evenly across the ground in their wake, and the dirt went clean behind them as if no one had ever walked there. At the tree line, they stopped. Theodore looked at her. She looked at him. He held out his fist, knuckles toward her, with the small, embarrassed smile of a man who could not quite remember when he had last done this. She tapped her knuckles against his. Then they walked into the demon forest. The trees closed behind them. A week later, in the capital, the queen was taking tea in her private salon when the prime minister was admitted. He bowed. He apologized for the disturbance. He delivered the news in the careful, flat tone of a man who knew the news might be worse than its surface. The court mages had reported a development. The tracking circle of one of the kingdom's senior knights had ceased registering. The circle was either erased or its bearer was dead. The knight in question was the one who had escorted the magic researcher Alice Brick to Valmore territory. Investigation at the village near the demon forest had confirmed. The pair had entered the forest on a scouting trip and had not returned. Their luggage and their horses had been left at the village. The official conclusion of the investigators on the ground was that the researcher and the knight had been killed by monsters in the forest. The queen took a sip of her tea. She set the cup down. She thanked the prime minister and dismissed him. She rang a small silver bell. A man in black appeared at the side of the salon as if he had been there all along. Eyeglasses, perfect black uniform, the careful smile of a person whose loyalty was both absolute and conditional. The queen explained, in summary, what the prime minister had told her. The man considered. Then he gave his opinion. The death conclusion, he said, was premature. The senior knight in question was the grandson of the late Lord Langston. He had won the kingdom's martial arts tournament the previous year. He was not the kind of man who died quietly in a forest in his first crisis. The queen's true concern, the man went on with the precision of someone who had been hired specifically for this kind of analysis, was not the loss of the knight. It was the question of what the researcher might be carrying. The researcher had developed a piece of significant magic. If she were alive, she was a national security problem. He proposed tighten border checks across the kingdom's perimeter, place watchers on the Langston family in the Luminato Republic, in case the knight were heading there, send his own men into the demon forest from the Valmore side to verify the death claim. He requested permission to do all of this on the queen's authority. The queen drank her tea. Yes, she said, do all of it. The man in black bowed once and was gone before her cup was back on the saucer. That evening, several small groups of black-clad men left the capital in different directions. The official record of the kingdom listed researcher Alice Brick and senior knight Theodore as presumed deceased in the demon forest, killed by monsters. The matter closed. The official record was a lie. The unofficial record had not yet been written. The forest moved through its first week with them. Alice had spent her career in a lab. Walking through a forest with monsters in it for 10 or more consecutive hours was, she discovered, a different category of experience. She fell over tree roots. She fell over more tree roots. By the morning of the 3rd day, she had fallen over enough roots that Theodore had developed an entirely silent reflex of catching her. He had stopped commenting on it. He had also stopped pretending he was not amused. She experimented. The lab habit was hard to put down. On the 1st day, she tried a fire lance array on a wood attribute monster. The notation was clean. The targeting was correct. The spell worked exactly as she had drawn it. The monster died. The forest caught fire. Alice cast a water sphere wide enough to drown the fire, drowned Theodore on the way through, and then stood in the steaming aftermath while Theodore, soaked from his hood to his boots, sword still in his hand, gave her a smile that was not a real smile and asked her, with extreme politeness, whether they could agree to stop using fire in this particular forest. She agreed. The next day, she tried earth magic against a stone attribute beast. The notation was correct. The earth attribute pulled too much from a tree behind them. The tree fell. Theodore caught her under one arm and dove sideways, and the trunk hit the ground a yard from where they had been standing. He did not say anything. She apologized. The day after that, she tried lightning, started another small fire, and apologized again. By the end of the 3rd day, Theodore had quietly negotiated a treaty, water and ice only, until they were out of the forest and somewhere with fewer trees trees and fewer combustible problems. He had said it in the tone of a man who had run out of patience, but had also decided not to use the patience he had run out of. Alice had agreed. She had also developed a new respect for the gap between knowing a notation and knowing what a notation did when it met the world. Then there was the mana exhaustion. She had read about it many times in the Institute archive. She had not actually experienced it. By the end of the second day, she was experiencing it. Headaches that started behind her eyes and walked slowly down to the base of her skull. Theodore explained, in the careful voice of someone who had learned this lesson the hard way, that mages were powerful in the moment and very fragile out of it. Mana ran out. When it did, the body started complaining. He told her to pace herself. She tried. She also got carried several times when she fell asleep walking. He carried her without complaint. He brought her fruit when he caught a black attribute bird that had bright orange berries in its claws. He started cleaning fish for dinner without asking. They settled into a rhythm that was less the rhythm of a knight and a researcher, and more the rhythm of two people who had been adjacent in each other's days for a long time and were now adjacent without anyone watching. By the fifth day, they had become a pair of professionals at this. When two black bears came at them at the edge of a clearing, bigger than the wolves, slower, harder to drop, Theodore took the lead bear's shoulder out with his sword, and Alice activated a tight ice arrow array she had drawn the night before. Both bears went down in under a minute. Alice reset her notation paper while Theodore wiped his blade clean. Neither of them said anything until it was done. They had stopped needing to. That fifth evening, Alice drew a wide-range barrier circle over their camp. The dome glowed faintly silver across the small clearing, enough magic to keep the night quiet inside the boundary. The barrier cost her enough mana to give her a minor headache, but the headache was acceptable. Theodore came back with 4 river fish on a green branch and a pocket of orange and red fruits. He grilled the fish over the fire with rock salt. Alice tested the fruits for poison with a small detection circle on paper. They ate the fish and the fruit by the firelight. The fish was very good. Magic is convenient, Alice said, around a mouthful of grilled fish. You say that every day. It keeps being true. He glanced at her sideways with the small smile that had been visiting his face in different shapes since the wolf attack. He spread the map between them and showed her where they were, a thumb's distance from a large mountain to the south. They were near the center of the forest, maybe another week to get all the way through to the Nortian Free State, depending on what the central region threw at them. After dinner, she used a clean water spell, a small array she had built years ago to avoid the indignity of going to the Institute baths. It rinsed the dirt off them without getting them wet. He thanked her seriously. She thanked him for the fish. They lay down on opposite sides of the fire. He waited until the camp had gone quiet. Then, in the careful voice he sometimes used when he was about to ask a question with more weight than its surface, Alice, after the forest, what will you do? She thought about it. The barrier dome above them shed a soft silver light. She thought about it some more. I have not really thought that far ahead, she said finally. I will keep doing research, somewhere. What about you? I have not decided either, he said. Then, more quietly, but I know what I want. She did not ask him what that was. She fell asleep before she would have had a chance to. The narrator can promise the audience that 2 days later, they would discover something that would extend the journey by considerably more than a week, and that the question Theodore had just asked would not be answered in the place Alice would have given as the answer. On the 7th afternoon, they came to a tree the size of a building. It rose so far above the canopy that Alice could not see its top from the ground. Theodore stared up at it for a moment, then turned to her and asked her to wait. He went up the trunk by hand and grip, body enhancement again, blue light moving across his shoulders, and was gone for 15 minutes. He came down at a controlled fall, a long jump, and one careful catch on a low branch. He looked grim. There is a building, he said, in the forest, beyond the central rise. From up there I could see its outline. Alice's first reaction was the wrong one. It was not fear, it was curiosity. Whatever was deep enough in the forest to require that height to see, that was a thing she wanted to look at. He carried her up to a wide, flat branch, about halfway up the trunk, where the canopy opened and direct sunlight reached them for the first time in a week. She stood in the warmth with her face tipped up and her eyes closed and let herself feel the sun on her skin. Theodore watched her without speaking, and the small smile from the bear fight came back to his face in a different shape. They looked at the map. They looked at the direction Theodore had seen the building. They looked at each other. They went toward the castle. The forest near the center was different. The trees were taller, the air was denser, the monsters were larger, and they came at the pair more frequently, and Theodore was working harder than Alice had ever seen him work. He used body enhancement nearly continuously. His blue light flickered and fought with his breath. By mid-afternoon, she watched him stagger after a particularly hard hit, and she put up a small barrier and made him sit down and drink water until his breathing came back to a rate that was within her acceptable range. He sat, he drank, he apologized in a way that was not really an apology, just an acknowledgement. They moved on more slowly after that. The terrain began to open. Stones in unusual squared shapes appeared along the path, stones that had been cut and placed by hands, then forgotten, then grown over by moss until they were almost part of the soil. Alice stopped at one and traced the edge with her finger. Artificial, old, not the work of anyone alive in the kingdom now. Then the well. It was a circle of squared stones, the same age as the path stones, the opening dark. Alice leaned over the edge. Theodore caught her by the back of her cloak before she went all the way in and dropped a small stone. The stone fell for a long count and made a faint splash. Water still down there after all this time. Looking down with her detection sense extended, she saw what she had expected and not expected at the same time. A faint circular line cut into the inner wall of the well, deep down, glowing very weakly, a magic circle. She did not have time to study it. Theodore raised one hand and his head tilted toward the south, and his other hand went to his sword, and his expression said, "Move now and discuss later." A large horned ox monster came out of the trees. It was the size of a small house. The horns were as long as Alice was tall. Theodore took its left front leg out with a clean strike. Alice caught it with an ice spear array as it staggered. It went down hard. They left the carcass. They moved past it toward where the trees opened. The trees did open. They came out at the edge of a wide clearing, and at the center of the clearing was a castle, half ruined. Walls collapsed in long sections, a watchtower leaning at an angle that should not have been possible, and a moat and a stone bridge, and the first sign of architecture they had seen since the kingdom proper. Alice felt the magic from the place before she saw it. A barrier, old, active, different from anything she had felt in the forest. Theodore felt something else. He stopped at the bridge's near end and held one hand back to her. "There is a person in there," he said quietly. She looked at him. "A ghost? Please do not say things like that." A small figure appeared at the far end of the bridge. It was a child, a girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She was standing on the bridge in a pale dress and a darker pinafore, holding a stuffed rabbit toy with one ear coming loose at the seam. Her hair was a soft brown. Her face was open and curious, and entirely unafraid. And the absence of fear was the thing that made the moment strange. She looked at Alice. She looked at Theodore. She held up the rabbit slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked, in the small voice of a child asking a question she has actually been wondering about. The forest behind them rustled. Alice and Theodore did not turn around. Both of them were looking at the girl. Alice opened her mouth. She closed it. After a moment, in the only voice she had left, We are looking for a castle." The girl considered this, the way a child considers any reasonable adult statement. Then she nodded. "This is the castle," she said. She turned around and walked back across the bridge toward the ruined gate, and after a few steps, she paused and looked over her shoulder at them, the rabbit dangling from one hand, and waited. The narrator notes only this, that the audience for this story has just met the first person who lives in this place, and that everything the story has been pointing at since the king's ceremony will, from this moment forward, run through this particular small girl on this particular bridge in this particular forest. The pursuit in the kingdom is happening too. The ice spears and the fire mishaps and the falling trees are now in the past. The next chapter of the journey begins on the other side of the bridge, when Alice steps onto the planks and crosses. She stepped onto the planks. She crossed. The bridge had a barrier on it. Alice felt it as she stepped across, a thin edge of someone else's magic, layered into the air like a closed door that recognized them as guests instead of intruders. By the time her boot hit the stone of that inner courtyard, the forest's pressure on her senses was simply gone. Inside the ruined walls was a settlement, not the kind a forest built, the kind people built. A grid of cultivated fields with rows of cabbage and tomato and onion. A stone forge with a chimney showing thin gray smoke. A small group of children at a stone trough doing laundry, looking up at the strangers with the mild curiosity of children who did not see strangers often. 2 women carrying baskets paused mid-step. A man up on the inner wall stopped sweeping. The whole place looked at them, and then, after one beat, went carefully back to work. Millie ran ahead. She crossed the courtyard at the determined trot of a child carrying important news. A young woman in a beige dress was setting down a basket of laundry by the stone trough. Millie collided gently with her hip, planted her feet, and announced, with the dignity of a courtier, that she had brought guests. The young woman looked up. The young woman saw Alice and Theodore. The young woman lost color in her face for 2 seconds and recovered it in the third. She set the basket down very carefully. She straightened. She came over. "Hello," she said in a voice that had decided to be calm whether or not the rest of her had agreed. "And welcome to this place with nothing in it." Theodore returned her bow. Alice opened her mouth to say something polite and accidentally found herself smiling instead, because Millie was holding the rabbit plushie up at chest height with both hands and watching her mother's recovery with the satisfaction of a child whose project had gone exactly as planned. The young woman led them across the courtyard to a stone building inset against the inner wall. She showed them up a narrow stair to a room on the second floor, a clean room, furnished with 2 beds and a wooden table, a window looking down on the courtyard. She gave them a key. She said someone would come and speak with them shortly. She left. Theodore set his pack down. He went to the window. He looked at the drop. He looked at the angle of the courtyard. He turned back to Alice with the small reassuring nod of a man who had just confirmed that they had at least one exit if they needed it. Alice sat down on the nearest bed. She watched him work. She thought about how a settlement of this kind should not exist in the middle of the demon forest. She wondered how the barrier was being maintained. She wondered who was maintaining it. She had questions. She did not ask any of them yet. The knock on the door came in 2 precise taps. Theodore opened it. The woman who entered was tall and pale-haired and elegant in the way that people are elegant when they were taught it before they were taught anything else. She introduced herself as Victoria. The man who entered behind her was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, and he stood at her left, slightly behind, and he had the kind of stillness that is not the same thing as relaxation. He was Owen. Victoria explained with formal politeness that she was the person responsible for this place. Alice stood. Theodore stepped slightly in front of her, both small movements, neither obvious. Victoria offered her hand to Alice. Alice took it. Victoria's hand was warm and careful and lingered on hers for a moment longer than was ordinary. Alice realized, when Victoria's eyes flicked once to her own and held, that Victoria was looking through her, that some kind of detection magic had just passed between her palm and Victoria's own. The flick of green silver in Victoria's eyes lasted half a second. Then it was gone, and Victoria smiled. And Owen, somewhere behind, where Alice could not see him, relaxed his shoulders by a 1/4 inch. Whatever Victoria had checked, Alice had passed. Victoria invited them to sit. They sat at the small wooden table. Owen stood. Victoria asked with the same formality how they had arrived in this place. By what route? With what intention? "We walked," Alice said. There was a pause. Theodore made a small sound that might have been a stifled laugh. Victoria's hand, which had been resting flat on the table, lifted to cover her mouth for a moment as her composure refolded itself. "Alice," Theodore murmured. "I think she is asking why," Theodore explained. The summary was short and accurate. They had been heading from the kingdom to the Nortian Free State. They had taken the demon forest because the forest had no checkpoints. They had not known the castle was occupied. They had not known anything about it. They had not been sent. Alice, for her part, had been looking out the window. The settlement she could see from up here was bigger than she had thought from the courtyard. A forge throwing real iron smoke, a small herd of goats, a woman beating a rug against a wall, 2 children running past with a wooden ball. None of it added up to a place that should exist where it was. She turned back to Victoria. "Did you know about this castle before you came?" Victoria's eyes lingered on her in that way again. The detection passed quickly this time. Alice answered honestly, no. They had heard there was a castle in the forest. The village 15 years ago had only 1 survivor. They had come because there was no other way through. Victoria nodded once. The nod was for Owen as much as for them. Owen relaxed properly for the first time since he had walked into the room. Then, Victoria delivered the warning that would shape the next 2 weeks of Alice's life. She told them, in the careful voice she had been using throughout, that the full moon was approaching. The forest's monsters grew stronger as the moon waxed. More importantly, for the 3 days before and after a full moon, a dragon descended from the mountain range to hunt in the forest below. The forest under a dragon was not a place anyone walked through and lived. The castle was safe, the barrier held against the dragon, but the open forest was not. Alice's first thought was the wrong one. It was not fear. It was, that explains the failed expedition 15 years ago. Her second thought was, dragon. Victoria saw the second thought hit. She gave Alice a small, kind smile that did not quite reach the corners of her eyes. Then, she invited them to remain remain at the castle until the full moon and its 3-day shadow had passed. Theodore offered in return to help with hunting. Victoria accepted. She paused, looking at Alice. Then, in the voice of a woman who was about to admit she needed something, "May I ask, are you a magic user, Miss Alice?" "I am a magic researcher." "Researcher." Victoria glanced at Owen. Owen glanced back. The exchange was very quick. Whatever it meant, it was not bad. "Then, if it would not impose, we have several damaged magic swords here that none of us have the skill to repair. They have been waiting for someone for a long time. If you would—" "Yes." Alice did not let her finish. "Absolutely. I will look at them tomorrow if you can show them to me." Theodore, beside her, did not even attempt not to smile. Victoria's composure briefly faltered into something that looked like genuine relief. Owen, behind her, made a small sound that might in another man have been a sigh. "Tomorrow," Victoria said. "Thank you." A middle-aged woman came up shortly after to lead them to a different room, their actual room on the first floor, with 2 beds divided by a curtain, formerly used by 2 young women who had since married and moved into houses of their own. She handed Theodore a key. She said dinner was in 2 hours. She left. Alice sat down on the right-hand bed and could not have said in that moment whether she was more excited about dinner, magic swords, or sleep. Dinner was the meal of someone's life. The vegetables were sweet in a way Alice's lab kitchen had never produced. The bread was slightly sour and dense. The meat was tender and herb-warm. Alice ate with the focused efficiency of a person who had been eating river fish for a week. Theodore ate similarly, with slightly more table manners. Across from them, Victoria conversed about ordinary things with the ease of someone who did this often. The weather over the canopy, the state of the harvest, the quality of the iron gonds had finished last week. Halfway through the meal, Theodore said something that made Alice look up. He had gone to train with Owen and the other fighters in the back courtyard while she had been napping, and he was reporting on it. There were several skilled fighters here, an archer who had asked many questions about the royal capital, a woman with 2 short swords, Owen himself, who Theodore described with quiet respect as a formidable expert. Alice listened without interrupting. The thing she filed: this settlement had quality of fighters that did not match its surface explanation. People who fought like this had been trained somewhere serious. They had not been trained in a remote castle in a forest no one knew about. She set the question aside for later. Right now, her body had decided that being warm and full and not in danger was a state it had not been allowed to fully experience in a long time, and her eyelids were objecting. She managed 3 more bites. She heard Victoria ask Theodore, very politely, whether Alice was his sister. Theodore said no. Alice tried to catch up with the question and could not. Her head, very slowly, found the table. When she woke up the next morning, she was in her bed with her boots off and her cloak draped over her like a blanket. She had no memory of getting there. She did vaguely remember saying thank you to someone before consciousness had finally given up on her. She would, she discovered as she sat up in the bright morning light, owe at least one thank you for that. In the capital that morning, Camille was having a worse start to his day. Captain Ross Turner, captain of the 3rd Knight Order, holder of an ancient magic sword that had been in the kingdom's archive of legendary weapons for over 1,000 years, a man not generally given to making polite calls on civil servants, was sitting across from Camille's desk and waiting with the patience of someone who was about to lose it. He had brought a letter. The handwriting was childish and a little ink-blotched. The letter read, "Dear Captain Turner, I am sorry. I have been ordered to leave the Institute and will not be able to maintain your sword going forward. The official Camille has been asked to take over. Please contact him for any future maintenance. Best regards, Alice." Camille read it. He felt the floor shift slightly. This was the 4th such letter that had arrived at his office in the past week. The other 3 had been from less famous knights and had been handled internally by being delegated to underlings who had not been able to handle them. Camille had been managing the situation by promising replacements who did not yet exist. He had not been managing it well. Ross asked, in the voice of a man who had clearly read the letter too. "I assume you can handle this, Captain?" Camille said yes. "Of course. The Institute would need a small amount of time to schedule the maintenance." Ross nodded once. He stood up. He told Camille that he would come back. Camille should make sure the sword was ready when he did. He left the office without saying goodbye. Camille sat down. He sent word to the Magic Research Institute with formal instructions to take on the maintenance. The reply came back 10 minutes later. The Institute had refused. He stood up and went to the Institute himself. The vice director had rumpled robes and the look of someone who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. He listened to Camille's request with the bone-tired patience of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for 14 days. Then, in the same patient voice, he explained what the Institute could and could not do. The Wide Area Barrier Project had consumed the Institute's senior research staff. Director Janet was not currently available to consult on operational decisions. There was no one in the Institute capable of reading the ancient notation on Captain Ross Turner's sword. Director Victor had been able to do it. Researcher Alice had been able to do it. No one else in the kingdom had been able to do it for nearly 50 years. Camille asked if Director Janet had been informed of this issue. The vice director said yes. The vice director added, with the careful selection of a man who had been waiting to use the words, Director Janet had reviewed the warnings and concluded that, since researcher Alice had been an orphan, her absence could not be a critical loss to the Institute's capability. Camille's face did not move. The vice director waited. Send to Valmore, Camille said finally. Ask her. Request that she... The vice director did not finish his sentence for him. He did not need to. Camille turned and walked back across the palace alone. The shadow that had been creeping toward his career for 2 weeks was now standing fully in the doorway of his office. He sat down at his desk, stared at the childish handwriting on the letter, and began to think about how many more such letters would arrive over the coming months, and how many of them he would not be able to answer. Alice met Grant at mid-morning. Victoria had taken her down to the forge. The forge was empty when they arrived, a tall stone room with a banked fire and several work surfaces, and Victoria explained, with mild apology, that the men were probably out behind the building working on the new clay furnace they were building for ironmaking. They went around the back. There, in a wider patch of stone-paved yard, an old man with a white beard and arms like firewood was packing wet clay around the inside of a half-built furnace, with the focus of a man who would be unhappy to be interrupted. Victoria coughed gently. The old man looked up. He saw Victoria first. His face softened. Then he saw Alice, and his face changed. It did not become unfriendly. It became wary. He set the clay tool down. He dusted his hands. He came over. Victoria introduced him as Grant, the settlement's blacksmith and the keeper of the forge, and the maker of most things that made the place run. Grant introduced himself and looked Alice over and finally said, "You are the magic researcher she mentioned." Alice said yes. She held out her hand. Grant looked at it for a moment as if it were a magic circle whose notation he was trying to verify, then took it. His grip was careful, the grip of a man who knew his own strength. He nodded once. He did not say welcome. He did not say it is good to meet you. He turned and led them back into the forge. He showed her the magic swords first, 4 of them, hanging on a rack at the back wall, each with its inscription tarnished or fractured or slipped out of true. Alice looked at all 4. Then she looked at the workbench beside the rack, where a heavy hammer with a circle inscribed on its head had been set down with a small folded cloth marking it. "Grant," she said, "may I look at the hammer first?" Grant turned around. "The hammer is mine. I see that. The inscription on its head is failing in a way that will pull error into anything you make with it. I would like to look at it before the swords." Grant looked at her for what felt like 10 seconds. Then he picked up the hammer, set it on the bench in front of her, and stepped back 2 paces. She unrolled her tools. She set out the magic ink, the quill, the small set of erasing implements, a fresh sheet of magic paper. She read the inscription. She found the failure, a small drift at one of the closing curves, the kind of degradation that creeps in when an inscription is heavily used and never reinforced. She built the correction on paper first, checked it twice, then transferred it to the hammer's head with a single careful motion. It took her 20 minutes. When she was done, she handed the hammer back. Grant took it. He held it in one hand and let the weight settle. Then he tested the inscription's response, a small tap on the anvil, and the gold notation on the head pulsed once, with the clean, even pulse of corrected work. He held it for a long moment. He did not say anything. He set it down. He looked at her. "The bench is yours," he said, "when you want it." Then he picked up his clay tool and walked back outside without saying anything else. Victoria watched him go. She turned to Alice with a small, relieved smile. "That," she said quietly, "is more welcome than he gives most people in years." The next several days fell into a shape. Alice came to the forge after breakfast and worked through the magic swords one at a time. The hammer had been the test. The swords were the work. Each one had its own kind of damage, tarnished inscription, fractured curvature, a notation that had drifted out of true under repeated use. Each one took her between 2 hours and a full afternoon. Grant set up a cleared corner of his workbench for her, brought her tea without being asked, and began sharpening the sword blades after she had restored their inscriptions. Theodore went out with the hunting party in the mornings. He came back at midday with game, and at dusk with whatever he had found along the way, fruit, one afternoon, a particular type of forest mushroom the next, oranges that he set on the corner of Alice's bench without comment. Grant noticed the oranges. He set down the file he was using on a sword's edge. "That knight of yours," he said, in the voice he used for matters of fact, "works too hard." Alice looked up. "I have been thinking that. He will burn out. I have seen it. Knights either learn to rest or they break. Most break." He went back to the file. After a moment, with the precise neutrality of a man who was about to give important advice, he described a small technique: hand massage. The pressure points on the back of the hand and the inside of the wrist, applied with steady firmness. Used by his mother on his father, when his father had come back from the smithy, unable to put down the hammer in his head. It worked even on knights who did not believe they could be made to relax. He showed her the points. Alice committed them to memory, the way she committed any technical procedure. That evening, Theodore wanted to go back out to help with leather tanning. Alice intercepted him at the door of their room, asked him to sit on the edge of the bed, and applied the technique. He tensed at first, the way he had tensed when she had picked up his sword for maintenance 2 years ago, and he had not yet fully trusted that she knew what she was doing. Then, slowly, he stopped tensing. His shoulders lowered, his breathing evened. Alice was halfway through the second hand when he was already asleep, sitting up, his head having drifted slowly forward onto her shoulder. She lowered him carefully onto the bed. She drew the sheet over him. She used a small clean water spell on her own hands, walked to her own side of the curtain, and went to sleep, listening to him breathe. On the third morning, Millie came to the forge with a small boy and asked to see magic. She had brought a request that Grant had not, until that moment, realized was a request she could make. She had never seen magic performed. The settlement had no magic users. The barrier was magic, but a barrier was a feeling, not a thing children could watch. Grant looked at Alice. Alice looked at Millie. Millie's specifications were clear. She wanted fun magic. Alice considered this for a long moment. Fun was not a category she had grown up using. She had been an orphan in a forest who had read books while other children had played. And the question of what would constitute fun magic for a small girl with a rabbit plushie was, briefly, the most difficult research problem she had been presented with in some time. She drew a water sphere notation on cut paper with a sustained shape modifier. She added a flow channel that would let the sphere change form under repeated activation. She built a stage out of wooden boxes with Grant's help in the middle of the square. She set the paper at the base of the stage. She activated the array. A water sphere appeared in the air above the boxes. Then it elongated downward into a thin curving slide. Then the slide pooled at its base into a shallow basin of clear water. Alice demonstrated the use of the slide by sitting on it. Then she held out her hand to Millie. For an hour, the square was full of children. More children than Alice had thought lived in the settlement. They came running from corners she had not noticed, took off their shoes, and went up and down the slide in sequences of joyful chaos. Alice expanded the array twice. The basin grew. A second slide appeared. Millie, the rabbit plushie, clutched in one hand, went down the slide a great many times. The hunting party came back through the back gate at the height of it. Theodore appeared at the edge of the square with Owen and Fred the archer, with his shoulder-length hair tied back, and the casual expression of a man who had thought he had seen everything until 5 seconds ago. Theodore's mouth was open in a small, surprised smile that he had not yet decided what to do with. Fred said something quiet and incredulous. Owen said nothing. Eventually, the children's mothers came. The children objected. Victoria arrived from the upper buildings, pale, calm, smiling, and dispersed them gently. The water dissolved when Alice released the array. The basin became damp paving. The square went back to being a square. Then, a man with thick spectacles came over and asked, with the careful politeness of someone who had been thinking about asking for a while, whether Alice could fill the agricultural reservoir while she was at it. Alice could. She did. That evening, she sat on her bed with a small private ache in her chest from being thanked too many times in one afternoon. She wrote a note in her notation book that simply said, "Water sphere with sustained shape modifier, viable for recreational structures." She closed the book. She slept hard. On the evening of the 4th day, Grant suggested a walk. He took her up the narrow stone stair to the wide flat top of the inner castle wall. The walkway was broad enough for a small carriage. Potted plants were growing along it in the patches where the sun reached longest. Herbs, vegetables, a small lemon tree. Grant explained, with the practical pride of a man who had been thinking about resource allocation for the last decade, that the settlement was running short on growing space, because too many children had been born in the last few years. They were planning to start rooftop farming within 3 years. They stood at the wall's edge and looked out over the trees. A great many things lived in the forest. Alice could see the eyes of one of them now, a large beast watching the wall from the shade of a tree near the bridge. Grant noted, dryly, that the barrier was the only reason the watcher had not already eaten them. Grant's tone suggested he had been making this joke for years. He turned and pointed at a thin, tall stone tower at the far end of the inner courtyard, separate from the main building. "That spire," he said. "Once the moon gets close to full, you can see the dragons from up there. Not for everyone, that climb, but the view's worth it." Alice filed the spire's location. Late that night, she woke to the sound of something that was not a sound, a pressure in the air, a low pulse of magic she could feel at the back of her teeth. Theodore was already standing at the window. He had not woken her with a touch. He had woken her by being awake. He turned when she sat up. "There is a dragon," he said quietly. Alice was already getting out of bed. The spire was deserted. The path through the back courtyard at this hour was, in Theodore's word, creepy. Theodore admitted in a low voice that he was generally not fond of places like this. Alice asked why. Theodore said something about not wanting to discuss certain categories of fictional creatures while standing in a dark stone building at 2 in the morning. Alice did not ask further. She filed it. The spiral staircase inside the spire was steep and irregular. Some of the stones were missing. Some of the stones were loose. About halfway up, on a stone that had decided to choose tonight, Alice slipped backward. Theodore caught her. The catch was so fast that Alice understood, by reflex more than thought, that he had been waiting for her to fall the entire climb. He did not put her back on her own feet. He picked her up properly, carrying her in front of him with one arm under her knees and the other across her back, and continued the climb. "You will fall again," he said. "Stop arguing." She had not been arguing. He carried her the rest of the way up. She could hear his heartbeat through the breastplate of his lighter armor. She made the mistake of mentioning this aloud. He asked her, quietly, with the embarrassment of a man who was simultaneously not slowing down and not making eye contact, to please not say things like that. She did not say it again. At the top of the spire was a small, wide stone platform open to the night air. The moon, nearly full, flooded the world below them in cold silver. The forest stretched out in every direction. The mountain range to the south rose in a single dark line. Then the dragon. It came up from the southern slope of the mountain in a long, slow rise, a thing of silver scales and length and terrible elegance. It opened its mouth and roared. The roar was a sound and also a pressure, and the pressure rolled across the air the way a stone rolls across water. Alice felt the magic in the air shake in response. Not the dragon's magic, the barrier's magic. The shaking was small. The shaking should not have been there at all. The dragon caught a great bear out of the forest below them in a single dive. The bear was the size of a small house. The dragon carried it back over the southern ridge and was gone. Alice did not move for a moment. Theodore set her down carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She was looking at the air where the magic had shaken. "I need to come back tomorrow." She came back the next morning, and the next afternoon, and the morning after that. On the second day, she watched the dragon return at the appointed hour and roar again. The roar made the air pressure shift. The barrier's magic did not visibly shake this time, but Alice was looking carefully now, and what she saw was a slow drift in the notation pattern around the bridge. The drift was not new. It had been there before the dragon arrived. The dragon was making it slightly worse with each roar, but it was not the cause. The cause was older. On the third day, she had her notebook with her and was making cross-tracking measurements every 15 minutes, the kind of repetitive observation she had done in the Institute when characterizing a slow process. Theodore came up the spire to check on her 3 different times during the day. Each time he found her sitting with her notebook on her knees and her eyes on the air over the bridge. The third time, he sat down beside her without saying anything. He waited until she was ready. On the third evening, she lowered the notebook and looked at it for a long time. The barrier was failing, not from the dragon. The dragon was an accelerant. The barrier had been losing structural integrity for some time, perhaps years, and the dragon's monthly visits were widening the cracks. Without intervention, at the current rate of decay, it would last another half year, possibly a year if the dragon's next several appearances were less aggressive than tonight's. She made the calculation 3 times. She got the same answer. She closed the notebook. She sat with her back against the stone of the spire's wall and watched the light leave the sky. She told Theodore that night on the wall. She told him plainly. The barrier they were inside, the only thing keeping the dragon and the deep forest beasts away from this settlement, had between half a year and a year left. She had verified it. She had measured it 3 days running. The cause was structural. The fix would require finding the source magic circle, which no one in the settlement had ever seen. Theodore listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked her, in the quiet voice he used for serious things, whether she was sure. Yes, he nodded once. He looked out at the moon. He stayed quiet for a while. Then, with a small, careful gesture, he lifted his hand and rested it briefly on her hair. The kind of touch that a person who had not done this before, but had decided to do it once, would do once, and never narrate. "All right," he said. "We tell Victoria tonight." Alice nodded. She thought about it. "How are we sure she will believe us?" He considered the question. "I have noticed something," he said carefully. "When the hunting party first started letting me train with them, the archer, Fred, he asked me a great many questions about the capital. The questions were the kind a man asks when he is trying to verify something. But after the first day, he stopped. Owen said only that Victoria had said it was fine. Then, everyone treated me like one of them. I think Victoria has a way of knowing whether someone is honest. I think you saw it. The light around her eyes." Alice remembered. The detection magic from the handshake. She had filed it. She had not put the pieces together until now. So she will know we are telling the truth. Yes. They walked along the wall in silence for a little while. The full moon was rising over the canopy. Somewhere out beyond the bridge, the forest was going about its evening with the particular hush it kept when the dragon was due. Then they went down the stone stair toward the warm light of the inner buildings. Victoria had laid out sweets. Apple pie with honey on the crust, small almond cookies, a thin lacy biscuit Alice had never seen before. The teapot was ornate in the way that only objects from a kingdom court tend to be ornate. Victoria explained, with light formal warmth, that the settlement had a sweets day on full moon nights. Full moons made the forest noisy, and the dragons sometimes came overhead, and the children needed something small to look forward to instead. Owen, beside her, ate 2 of the almond cookies in quick succession and did not look up. Alice ate a slice of apple pie. It was extraordinary. She said so. Victoria smiled at the praise the way a person smiles when an honest compliment lands in a room that does not get many of them. Then, in the careful turn of conversation Alice had come to recognize, Victoria asked what Alice had wanted to discuss. Alice set down her plate. She did it the same way she had done it on the wall. The barrier. Half a year. Possibly a year. Structural decay. Accelerated by the dragon. She would need to find the source magic circle to attempt repair. The room went very quiet. Owen's hand stopped halfway to a cookie. Victoria's smile did not move from her face, but the smile had become a different shape. The smile of a woman who had just been told the thing she had been afraid of for years. After a long moment, she took a small breath. She set her own plate down. She asked Alice if she was certain. Alice said yes. Victoria nodded slowly. She said, in a voice that had become very even, that she had feared something like this for some time. She did not know the magic circle's location. Neither did Owen. The barrier had been here when they had arrived 8 years ago. She was not aware of anyone in the settlement who had ever seen the circle that produced it. She added, after a small hesitation, that the adventurer Bart's expedition 15 years ago had not reported a barrier, so whatever it was had come into being sometime between 15 and 8 years ago. Alice and Theodore exchanged a look. Bart, the same Bart whose ruined expedition the village chief at Khosra had warned them about. Victoria caught the look. She saw what it meant. Then, after another small hesitation that was clearly the result of a calculation she had been making for the last half hour, she said, "There is a story I should tell you, about who we are. It would not be polite to keep it from you when we are about to ask you for something this large." Outside, somewhere over the canopy, the dragon roared once. The barrier shook again. Alice felt it, the way one feels a weight on a thin floor. Owen reached for his teacup with the deliberate slowness of a man buying himself a moment. Victoria looked down at her hands for a long count, then up at Alice. She began, in a low and careful voice, to tell them about the day, 8 years ago, when she and her people had been forced to leave the capital and had not been allowed to return. Victoria's story took 20 minutes to tell. She and her people had lived in the capital of Gazen Kingdom. 8 years ago, there had been an incident. Victoria did not name it, and Alice did not ask. And the consequence had been a forced relocation. The order had not arrived as a banishment. It had arrived as a recommendation. An adventurer named Bart had recently surveyed the forest of Valmore territory and reported finding an old castle in good enough condition to support a community in temporary residence. The royal directive was that Victoria's group would relocate there for a year of recuperation, after which a recall order would be issued. Most of the group had family members held as hostages in the capital to ensure compliance. They had traveled to Valmore Overland, lost several people on the journey, and reached the forest at the end of their resources. They had found the castle in the last hour of the last day they could have searched. They had moved in. A year had passed. The recall order had not come. Several of the children born in those first months had died of the kingdom's silent decision not to send doctors. The dragon's monthly visits had made return travel impossible. The forest itself had developed a reputation among them as a thing that took people. The hostages, their families, had stopped writing. The recall order had still not come. 8 years had passed. The castle was their life now. The capital was a place they no longer planned to return to. Alice listened. She did the math in her head as Victoria spoke. The blacksmith Grant, who had recognized a notation flaw in his own hammer at 30 seconds. The chef who could turn forest fish into a meal worth describing. The fighters Theodore had described as trained beyond ordinary. The strategist who had spent 8 years maintaining a hidden community without losing more than necessary. None of them were ordinary settlers. They were people the kingdom had pushed into a forest and then pretended to forget. Alice glanced at Theodore. He nodded. She summarized her own story in 3 sentences. She had developed a piece of magic the kingdom had wanted. The kingdom had given her Valmore territory as a reward that was actually a disposal. Theodore, she explained simply, had been collateral damage. Theodore made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Victoria did not laugh. Victoria looked at them, first at Alice, then at Theodore, then back at Alice, with the steady assessing gaze of a woman who had just confirmed something she had been hoping. Then she smiled, properly, for the first time since the diagnosis. "Then we are here for the same reason," she said, from 2 different directions. The silence that followed was a comfortable one. The next morning, the search began. Victoria knocked on doors with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 8 years being responsible for a settlement. She introduced the concept of barrier magic at every door, politely, briefly, without alarm. Alice had pointed out that if the barrier did fail and the residents only learned about it then, the panic would be worse than knowing about it now. Victoria agreed. Now the conversations all started with, "I am sorry to disturb you, but we are looking for something called a magic circle, and I would like to introduce you to the idea of barrier magic before we go further." In every room, Alice walked slowly along the floor and felt for a reaction. Her detection range was short, a circle about 2 meters across her body, no more. She covered it methodically. Each room took 10 minutes. Each room produced nothing. They worked through the residential wing, then the back courtyard, where Victoria distracted the chickens and Alice walked through the sheds. Nothing. They worked through the tower's lower floor, where Owen was carrying boulders that were larger than he was, and Theodore was carrying boulders that were larger than Owen's. Alice checked the cleared section of the floor. Nothing. She climbed the tower's stair to the top because she liked towers and because she wanted to think about why the search was failing. From the top, she could see the green of the canopy and the line of the southern mountain. The dragon was not visible today. She did not know whether she preferred it that way. By the end of the second day, they had checked the back gate's rubble, the underground storage rooms, the well, every visible ceiling. The barrier was here. They could feel it on the bridge. Its source was somewhere in this building, and the source was hiding the way only ancient deliberate work hides, not as an accident of geometry, but as a feature of design. Alice sat on the wall that evening and thought about what kind of person designed a barrier whose source could not be found by ordinary means. She thought about it for a long time. The breakthrough arrived 2 days after the full moon, by accident. Alice was at the forge. She was finishing the inscription on Owen's great sword, the last of the magic blades on Grant's repair list. Grant had been watching her work and had said, in the matter-of-fact way of a man delivering a small compliment, she had outperformed the original maker on every blade. He added that she would be leaving soon and asked if there was anything she needed him to make. Alice did not have an answer for him yet. She thanked him. She went back to her room. Theodore came in a little later with the news she had been waiting for and not wanting. Victoria had said not to worry about the search anymore, that they had done enough, and that they should go ahead with their planned departure. The magic circle was hidden somewhere they could not access in the time they had. Victoria did not blame them. Victoria was being kind. Alice sat on her bed for 10 minutes. Then she got up and went outside and asked Theodore to help her search again. They walked to the spire's base. Alice was standing in the courtyard staring up at the wall and trying to think of what she had not yet thought of when the dragon's roar arrived from the southern ridge. The sound was distant. The dragon was leaving, not coming. The pressure of the roar passed through the air the way it always did. The barrier shook the way it always did under the dragon's voice. Alice felt the shake on her skin. and she stopped moving. The dragon's roar was carrying magic. The roar was a sound. The roar was reaching the barrier through the air. Magic did not normally travel through air without a carrier. The dragon's magic was using the sound as a carrier, which meant magic could be carried on sound, which meant a person who clapped her hands could send a small wave of her own magic outward through the air. And if there were notation in that air's path, the notation would respond. Alice asked Theodore for one piece of magic paper. She asked him to hide it. While he was hiding it, she stood in the middle of the courtyard with her eyes closed and built a small mist array on her palm, a tiny notation that would release her own magic into the air around her in a thin, invisible cloud. Then she clapped her hands. The mist spread outward. It found the paper Theodore had hidden in his belt pouch behind a low wall 30 paces away. Alice felt the response come back through the air the way she had felt the dragon's roar through her skin. She opened her eyes. "There," she said, pointing. "The paper is right there." Theodore, who was standing exactly there with the paper in his belt, said, "How did you know?" "Sound," she said. "Sound carries magic. We can use it to find the circle." For 5 hours, she swept the castle with sound. She walked from room to room, mist array in one palm. Clap once, listen, move on. The settlement was asleep around them. Theodore walked beside her with the patient watchfulness of a man who had done escort duty for so long that he no longer thought about what he was guarding, only about the fact of the guarding itself. The first 4 hours produced nothing. In the 5th hour, exhausted, Alice went back to her own room for one final check before giving up for the night. She built the mist. She clapped. She listened. Something responded, faint, beneath them, not in the room, not in the floor, below the building's foundation, somewhere in the ground. Alice and Theodore looked at each other. "It is below us," she said, "far below. The entrance to the chamber where it is. That has to be in a place that can take a real load. A passage downward needs a structurally sound wall above it. Most of the residential building is above hollow space. The entrance hall has the thickest walls in the castle. I would put the entrance there." They went to the entrance hall. The hall was empty at this hour. The stone walls rose to a high ceiling. They walked the perimeter slowly, both of them looking for something they did not yet have a description of. Alice felt it before she saw it. A patch of wall to the left of the main inner doorway. The patch was perfectly ordinary by every visual measure. Stone of the same age, fitting of the same precision. But Alice's hand felt a small wrongness when she held her palm an inch above the surface. The kind of wrongness a researcher feels when she is looking at notation that is not quite right. She pressed. The wall did not respond. She pressed harder in a slightly different place. A section of the floor beside her, 3 paces away, made a sound the floor was not supposed to make. A low grinding shift and dropped. The dropped section was a trapdoor. Below it, a long stone staircase descended into darkness. Theodore lit a small oil lamp with the magic paper fire array Alice handed him. He examined the wall mechanism. It could be released and locked from inside the staircase. They would not be trapped. Theodore went down first. Alice followed. The trapdoor closed quietly behind them, as if it had been doing this for 1,000 years and was simply continuing. The staircase was longer than the building above it had any right to be. They walked down, down, down again. The air went cold and old. The lamp flame burned a little differently in it, the way flame burns in air that has not been moved in a long time. At the bottom of the staircase, the corridor opened into a wider stone passage. Doors were set along its length at intervals. One of the doors stood open. Alice looked into the open room. A magic circle was set into the floor, about 1 meter across, old, beautiful in the specific way that ancient notation was beautiful. Every line precise, every angle harmonized with every other angle, every choice deliberate. Alice's breath stopped for a second. The circle was not the barrier. She could feel it was not. Its scale was wrong. Its function set was wrong. But it was an ancient circle of a quality the Institute archive in the capital did not contain. Theodore put his hand on her shoulder. He did not need to say it. They were not here for this circle. They continued down the corridor. The light at the far end was getting brighter. The pressure in the air was getting denser. At the corridor's end was a stone door. Theodore opened it slowly. The chamber on the other side was wide and tall, and the entire floor of it was a magic circle. The circle was made of mithril. The metal was inlaid into the stone of the floor in lines and curves and runes that filled the whole space. 5 meters across at least, perhaps more. It was active. The notation was glowing a steady soft gold, and the gold was very faintly trembling, the way air trembles over a hot road. Alice walked into the chamber. Her mouth was open. She knelt at the edge of the circle. She placed her palm above the nearest line, not on it, because she would not have touched it for any sum she could imagine, and she felt the circles running. The mechanism was alive. alive. It was old. It was working at the edge of what it had been designed to do. "This is it," she said. Her voice was not quite her ordinary voice. "There is no doubt." Theodore stood at the chamber's threshold and watched her. 2 hours, he said quietly. She agreed without looking up. She used her 2 hours. She knelt at the edge of the circle and copied the notation she could see. Paper laid out beside her, quill moving in fast, confident strokes, ink stains spreading across her fingers. She mapped the visible portion of the circle in sections. The circle was enormous. 2 hours was nothing against it. She got perhaps a third of the way around the rim and a sketch of the central anchor pattern. It was already more ancient notation than she had seen in her entire career. Theodore did not stand at the threshold the whole time. After the first half hour, he went exploring the corridor. He came back at the end of the 2 hours with notes. 4 smaller rooms branched off the main passage. Each one had a magic circle of its own, smaller than this one, simpler in design, but each clearly active in its own way. He did not know what they were for. He had not entered them. He had only opened each door enough to confirm. Alice filed this. She would investigate the smaller rooms once she had documented this one. When the 2 hours were up, Theodore came across the chamber and offered her a hand to stand. She took it. Her legs had stiffened from the kneeling. The lamp's oil was nearly gone. They walked back through the corridor, past the open door to the smaller circle, up the long staircase. Theodore released the inner mechanism, and the trapdoor lifted above them. They climbed out. The trapdoor closed behind them as they emerged into the entrance hall. The hall was lit gray by the first thin morning light through the high, narrow windows. It was dawn. They walked back to her room together. Neither of them spoke. Alice was past the kind of tired that allowed for words. Theodore opened her door for her, helped her sit on the edge of the bed, and crossed to the corner where her bag was. "I will go tell Victoria," he said. "You sleep. I will come back later." She nodded. She started to unlace one of her boots. The day had been more than a day. The night had been more than a night. Her hands wanted nothing to do with the laces. Theodore paused at the door. He turned back. "Oh," he said. "I almost forgot. I found this on the floor of the first room, the one with the smaller circle. It was right at the edge. I thought it might be yours." He held something out in his palm. Alice held out her hand without really looking. He set the object in her palm. It was an earring, a small silver disc, shaped into a fine inscription pattern, set on a thin silver post. Alice looked at it. She turned it over once. She raised her left hand to her right ear and touched the earring she had been wearing, the one she had been wearing every day for as long as she could remember, the only piece of jewelry she owned. She felt it. Her earring was still there. The earring in her palm was identical to it, not similar, identical. The same disc, the same inscription, the same delicate silver post, the kind of identical that meant they had been made as a pair. Alice did not move for a long moment. Theodore had already left. The pale morning light came through the window and caught on the earring in her palm and on the one in her ear. Her mind, slowly, brought up a memory she had not visited in a long time. Victor sitting at his desk in the lab. Alice as a very small girl, asking him once, only once, about her parents, about where she had come from before he had found her in the snow. Victor's careful voice. He had told her the truth as he knew it, that she had been alone in an alley when he had found her, that she had not been able to give him a name beyond Alice, that he had taken her home, that the kingdom's records of orphans had not produced any account of where she had come from before that. He had also told her, gently, that she had had only one earring when he found her, a single silver disc on a thin post in her right ear. He had asked her if she remembered the other one. She had not. Alice closed her hand around the earring in her palm. She did not call Theodore back. She did not go to find Victoria. She slid the second earring carefully into the small inner pocket of her satchel, where she kept her most fragile notation copies. She lay down on the bed with her boots still partly on. She did not sleep for a while. Then she did. Alice woke in her own bed, sometime in the late morning. The 2 earrings were still on the small table where she had left them. Her original, the scratched one she had worn since Victor had found her, and the second one, with no scratches, identical in every other respect. She put on her own and wrapped the second in a handkerchief and slid it to the back of the small wardrobe shelf where she kept her notation drafts. She did not look at it again. The decision did not feel like a decision. It felt like a thing she would deal with later, when there was a later for it. What there was now was a barrier circle the size of a small plaza, glowing gold beneath the entrance hall, and a settlement that needed it to keep working. She found Victoria and Theodore at the entrance hall. The hall had been sealed off. Victoria had ordered it overnight, with a polite hand-lettered notice citing the ceiling's age and the danger of falling stone. Victoria had heard the full report from Theodore. She had decided, before Alice had gotten out of bed, that the underground was not to be casually visited. The 3 of them descended together. Victoria carried a lamp, Owen had wanted to come, Theodore mentioned in passing, but Victoria had told him to stay above and resume his ordinary duties. In the chamber, the great mithril circle glowed steadily. Victoria had not been prepared for the scale of it. She walked the perimeter slowly, her hand at her own throat in a small involuntary gesture, and stopped at the center mark. "This is what protects us," she said. The voice was different from her court voice. It had the edge of a woman who had carried the fear of losing this for a long time. "This is what protects you," Alice agreed. Alice told her the plan. She would need a month, perhaps more, to analyze the circle's notation deeply enough to identify the failure mode and design a repair. Victoria looked at her. Victoria looked at the circle. Victoria looked at Theodore. Then Victoria turned back to Alice, bowed just slightly, and asked her, formally, in the tone of a woman speaking from a position she had not used in 8 years, to do whatever she could. She also added, with a small smile that held something unspoken in it, "Not at the cost of meals or sleep." Alice agreed. What Alice would not learn until later was the rest of who Victoria had become while exiled. The healing power that did not come from magic. The holy power Victoria used on a child's broken leg the next afternoon. The 3 retainers who had followed her into the forest with demon swords across their backs. Owen and the archer Fred and the redhead Emma. The memory of a kingdom that had tried to dispose of its own first princess by sending her to a forest the kingdom believed would do the work the kingdom did not want to do itself. Alice would learn it gradually over the coming weeks, the way one learns a place's truth by living in it. For now, she sat down at the edge of the circle and began to read. 4 weeks later, in the capital, a male researcher stood across from Janet's desk and delivered the news he had been delivering for 3 weeks in slightly different forms. The wide area barrier replication experiment had returned its latest result. 6 mages, under the Institute's most controlled conditions, had been able to maintain the barrier for 7 days. The original paper, written officially by Director Janet, documented 3 mages for 14 days. The numbers were the wrong way around. 6 should produce more than 3. More days, not fewer. The research did not work that way, the researcher said, with the careful preamble of a man who had practiced his sentence. One of the mages had reported that the mana flow into the magic circle felt different from what the paper described. Different, the researcher said, not insufficient. Something about the activation pattern was specific in a way the paper did not capture. He hesitated. Then he asked the question he had been forbidden to ask. Could they not? He said quietly. Recall researcher Alice Brick. Janet did not look up. She told him, in the tone of a person ending a conversation, that he was not to mention that name again. The Institute had everything it needed in the documentation. He was instructed to consult the vice director on whatever practical issue he was failing to resolve. He should not return to her office until the experiment matched the paper. The researcher bowed. He left. Janet sat at her desk for a long time afterward and did not actually do any work. The forts in the border wasteland, the 4 forts being built for the planned campaign against the Lumina Kingdom, were waiting on the wide area barrier they had been promised. The campaign could not begin without the barrier. The barrier could not be replicated by the institute that owned the paper. Janet did not write any of this down. In the castle, that same evening, Alice was eating soup with a fork. She had been on the underground circle for 1 month. She had decoded around 80% of the visible notation, the side of the mithril plate she could see. The rest of the circle was not visible. The plate had a reverse face, and the reverse face was on the rock side of the slab, and the slab was inlaid into the stone of the floor and could not be moved. Without the reverse, she could not understand the power source. Without the power source, she could not design a clean repair. She had hit the wall. Theodore reached over and gently exchanged her fork for a spoon. "Alice, that's a fork." She looked at the soup. She looked at the fork. She accepted the spoon. "I am thinking. You are not eating. That is one of the symptoms." A cheerful voice came from behind her. Fred sat down across the table without invitation and reached for Alice's hair to take out what turned out to be a small breadcrumb. Theodore intercepted his hand midair with the small movement reflex Alice had seen him use on monsters. "Save your hand," Theodore said, in the voice he used for friends. "I will get it for her." Emma arrived a minute later, took the seat next to Alice, and told Fred to stop teasing Theodore. She was in her ordinary clothes, leather over linen, but Alice could see the thin magic sword at her hip where it always was. Alice had filed Emma in her head as another of the trained fighters. Tonight, after Theodore's analysis on the wall some weeks ago, she filed her again, with the addition Emma was probably one of Victoria's 3. The 4 of them ate. Alice asked casually whether anyone in the settlement had ever found old documents in any of the rooms, the kind that might describe the construction of magical things. Emma stopped chewing. She thought about it. "Yes," she said. years ago. She could not remember exactly when. Behind a stone bookshelf in one of the residential wing's storage rooms, a bundle of paper. They had pulled it out. The paper had crumbled when touched. Whatever had been written on it had been gone for a long time. Alice felt something settle into the right place in her head. The bundle behind a bookshelf had crumbled, but there might be other places. Places without the heat and the air of an open room. Places preserved by being sealed. The basement was one such place. She had walked through the corridor down there 100 times in the past month, and she had been looking only at the Great Circle. Theodore offered, between bites of bread. Tomorrow was his day off. They could go down together, search the side rooms and any wall they had not pressed. Alice accepted. Fred made a small joke that Alice would have rolled her eyes at if she had been less tired. Emma rebuked him without conviction. The dinner ended with the cheerful low noise of a meal in a room of people who had begun to know each other. Alice did not yet know that the next morning would be the morning that would change the structure of the rest of the arc. Before dawn the next day, they ate, packed lunches, and went down. Theodore wanted to start with the walls in reach. Alice agreed. They split the chamber's perimeter and walked it slowly, hands at stone height, looking for the small wrongness of a hidden mechanism. The morning passed. They found nothing. They ate the packed lunch on the cold floor of the corridor. After lunch, they tried one of the side rooms Theodore had glimpsed, but not entered on the first night. The door was stone. Theodore opened it slowly. Inside was a small chamber, holy stone, with a magic circle inlaid into the floor. The circle was about 2 meters across. It was not glowing. Alice walked in. The notation was unfamiliar in the precise way that very old notation was unfamiliar, close enough to her training to be readable, distinct enough that she had not seen this exact pattern before. The symbols included spatial markers, a teleportation array possibly, dormant, centuries old. She wanted to test it. Theodore asked very quietly whether she was sure. She told him she was going to channel a tiny amount of mana, just enough to read the circle's response, not enough to activate. She had done this kind of probe 1,000 times. She knelt at the circle's edge, refilled the inscription's grooves with a thin stroke of magic ink, and laid the tip of her finger above the outer ring. She let a thread of mana into it. The circle drew her mana the way a vacuum draws air. Her hand stuck to the stone. Her vision whitened at the edges. She heard Theodore's voice, a sharp call of her name, and she felt him cross the room toward her, and she felt his arm catch her shoulder a half second before the chamber filled with a wall of golden light that was not a thing she had built or chosen. The light closed over both of them. The chamber was empty. A small pencil rolled out of Alice's chest pocket and came to a stop on the stone. The light faded. The room was quiet again. Victoria was crossing the courtyard when she realized something was wrong. Grant came up to her, hammer in his hand. He had been looking for Alice. The magic hammer's inscription needed adjustment, and Alice had told him she would look at it before dinner. Alice had not appeared. He had been waiting most of the afternoon. Emma came across the yard a few minutes later. She had not been able to find Theodore for training. She had checked the building, the walls, the spire. Owen joined them. Fred came in from the back gate. The 5 of them moved through the castle systematically. Their rooms were empty. The corridors were empty. The cook reported that Alice had taken a packed lunch that morning, with the casual mention that she was going to do some searching in the basement. Victoria thought about it. Then she went to the entrance hall. She found the wall mechanism, with Theodore's quiet description of how it worked still in her memory. She pressed the panel. The trapdoor opened. She and Owen and Fred descended. The chamber with the great circle was empty. The corridor was empty. They opened each side room. The first door they tried, the one with the small dormant circle Theodore had reported on the first morning, had a pencil on the floor. No people. Victoria picked up the pencil and turned it over twice in her fingers. The pencil belonged to Alice. Outside the castle, the moon was rising over the canopy. The dragon was likely flying tonight. The air over the forest was the kind of air it flew in. Victoria looked at Owen. If they were not back by morning, she said, she would send a search party at first light. Until then, she would trust them. She did not want to send anyone into the night. Owen agreed. They climbed back up. The trapdoor closed behind them. Victoria stood in the entrance hall for a long time before she went to find a window from which she could watch the moon. Alice woke with her head on Theodore's lap. The headache was the first thing she noticed. The cold was the second. The third was that the ceiling above her was not the same ceiling. The room she was in was older. The stone was cracked. The air smelled of mold and old earth. Theodore was sitting cross-legged with her head on his thigh, holding a small oil lamp aloft, so its light fell on her face. "Stay there," he said, with great care. "It is mana exhaustion. You activated a teleportation circle," she remembered. Her mouth made a small, unhappy shape against the dust. Above them, somewhere not very far above them, a heavy step landed, then another. Something the size of a small house was walking on what sounded like stone. Alice could not see it. Theodore could not see it. Whatever it was passing the area and not stopping. Yet, he gave her his canteen. She drank slowly. He gave her his outer coat, which was several sizes too large for her. She put it on with the small affection of someone who had decided to find the size funny later. She slept on his shoulder for the time it took her mana to come back enough to stand. Then they explored. The room they had landed in had a teleportation circle on the floor identical in size to the one Alice had activated in the castle's basement. They were in a mirror installation. The corridor outside the room was ruined, collapsed in places, stone rubble blocking 3 doors. They followed the corridor in the only direction it allowed. After 30 paces, they reached a wider chamber. In the wider chamber, a thick metal slab stood embedded in the floor at a tilted angle, as if some old earthquake had pushed it up onto its edge. The slab was huge. Alice walked toward it slowly. As she got closer, the inscription on its visible face came into focus. It was the barrier circle, the same one in the castle's basement, to every line, to every mark. She knew it by heart now, after a month of work. She could have drawn it from memory. Then she went around to the other side. The reverse face had a different magic circle, more complex, the power source notation she had been unable to access, the piece of the design she had been missing. It was here. She knelt and copied as much of it as she could, quickly, carefully. Every spare piece of paper she had with her, covered with the lines and runes of a notation she would not have been allowed to copy in a lifetime of Institute archive access. She worked for an hour. She got the whole reverse face onto paper. While she worked, Theodore searched the rest of the chamber. He came back with a leather scroll case sealed by an old preservation circle that had outlived most of the room around it. Inside the case was a map of magical beast leather, more than 1,000 years old by the smell of it, showing this region of the continent in detail Alice had never seen on any modern document. Alice took the map with her ink-stained fingers and felt something she did not have a word for. The shape of the territory, the placement of the rivers, the position of certain ruins relative to certain mountains. She felt as if she had seen it before, as if her body remembered it. Theodore watched her face. He had been waiting, she suspected, to ask the question for some time. Alice, since we came here, you have said more than once that something feels familiar to you. You did it just now. She did not answer him directly. She told him what little she knew. She had been an orphan when Victor found her. The orphanage director had said the kingdom had no record of where she had come from before. She had had only one earring then. She had decided, when she was older and had asked, that some questions did not have answers. She had stopped asking. Theodore nodded once. He did not push. She rolled the map and tucked it into her satchel beside the second earring. They stepped onto the teleportation circle together. She channeled her mana into it slowly, with Theodore standing close enough that the circle would take both of them. The chamber filled with gold light. The room emptied behind them. They woke on the floor of the small chamber in the castle's basement, side by side, with the dormant circle quiet again beside them. Alice's mana was gone for the second time in 24 hours. Theodore had been knocked out by the return jump too. He was already sitting up by the time she opened her eyes. They climbed the staircase. The trapdoor lifted easily. The morning gray of the entrance hall met them. They walked out and saw, from across the courtyard, every important person in the settlement standing together at the back gate. Victoria, Owen, Fred, Emma, Grant. A search party assembled, and moments from departing, Emma saw them first. Emma ran. Emma reached Alice before the others had registered. The hug was hard and brief. Fred caught up next, clapped Theodore on the shoulder hard, and made a joke about choosing more obvious places for trysts. Theodore did not respond to the joke. Owen and Grant arrived together, neither of them saying anything but both of them, with the quiet relief of men who had not slept. Victoria came last. She stopped in front of Alice, took her by both shoulders, and looked at her for 1 count, 2 counts, 3. Then she let her go. You are not hurt. No. Tell me later. Yes. The party broke up. Grant clapped Theodore's back once, hard, and went to his forge. The knights returned to their duties. Victoria walked Alice and Theodore back to the building. Alice and Theodore took the long way around the courtyard before they went inside. In the moment of privacy on the path between the hall and their building, Theodore stopped walking. Alice, the teleportation. Yes, I think, he said carefully. We should keep it between ourselves, not Victoria, not the others. Alice waited for him to go on. The kingdom has agents in the capital, and quite possibly nearer than we know. If the existence of an active teleportation network in this territory ever reached them, the response would not be peaceful. Even if Victoria's people kept it a secret, and they would, secrets like this leak by accident. I want as few people knowing as possible. She thought about it. Her instinct was for honesty. Her instinct also remembered the king's eyes from the audience hall. Yes, she said, let us keep it. I am tired of being involved in royal politics anyway. He almost smiled. They went back to the room. Alice slid the new copy of the reverse side barrier notation into the inner pocket of her satchel, beside the map and the second earring. The satchel was now carrying 3 things she would not be telling anyone about for a while. She fell asleep with her boots still on. Theodore set them by the door before he went to sleep on his own side of the curtain. The morning got brighter outside. In the institute in the capital, Janet stared at a page of notation she could not understand. In the Queen's tea salon, the hunt for the missing researcher had been formally downgraded. In Alice's satchel, the reverse side circle waited to be analyzed. The repair was finally possible. The 2 weeks went past, the way work goes past for someone whose attention has been completely captured. Alice copied the reverse side notation from her ruins collected papers onto fresh sheets, laid them out on the chamber floor in the correct rotational alignment with the visible face of the mithril circle, and walked the diagram with her finger an inch above the stone for hours at a time. She ate the meals the settlement sent down. She slept in increments. Theodore came down twice a day to make sure she was still vertical, and to put a hand on her shoulder for one quiet count before going back up to whatever he was working on above. The reverse side told her the rest of the answer. The circle was not a stored power array. The reverse face was a draw mechanism. It connected through a long invisible channel of geological alignment to deep formations far below the castle's foundation, where over a very long time, the earth itself had concentrated magical conductivity in a way that no human magic could imitate. The barrier did not need to be fed. It drew. As long as the connection notation held its shape, the barrier would run. As long as the earth had not changed underneath, the connection would hold. The mechanism was a perpetual engine. She did the calculations 3 times because the result kept seeming too elegant to be true. It was true. Each time she ran it through, she found another small grace of design. The circle was built to last. The decay had been a maintenance problem, not a design flaw. Somewhere along the way, the original builders had stopped reinforcing certain connection lines on a regular schedule, and the lines had drifted out of true the way old stitching drifts out of true when no one keeps it tight. The repair was reinforcement, not invention, restoration, she thought, late on a night when she could no longer pretend to be working, about who had built this. They had not been a primitive people. They had been a people who built for centuries and then they had stopped, and someone had not rebuilt this in a long time. There was a question in there she did not yet have a way to ask. She put the papers in order. She slept 8 hours for the first time in a fortnight. She woke up calm. It was time to do the repair. She did the repair on a sunny afternoon. Theodore was with her. Above ground, the day was clear. The grass beyond the bridge was growing in for the season. The children who lived inside the barrier had spent the morning helping the village chief's wife with the early vegetables. Down here, the chamber was lit by 2 lamps and the steady quiet gold of the circle's existing glow. Alice knelt at the circle's edge with her tools laid out in a precise arc, the pen, the bottle of magic ink, the paper sheets with the reverse face corrections she had spent the morning calibrating one last time. She had eaten breakfast. She had drunk water. Her mana was at the highest level she had carried in 2 weeks. She was as ready as she could be. She began at the closest line of degraded notation and worked outward. The repair was not dramatic from the outside. It looked like a researcher with steady hands moving slowly around the perimeter of an enormous magic circle, dipping her pen, restoring small lengths of inscription, dipping again, restoring again. There was no flash. There was no incantation. Each correction was a single careful stroke. Each stroke had to be exactly right because the alignment was what made the connection hold, and the connection was what kept the barrier above them alive. 4 hours. When the last correction was laid down, she set her pen on the cloth beside her papers and held her breath. She did not need to activate the circle. The circle was already activating itself. The connection lines were responding to the restored geometry the way a cracked dam responds when the engineer has finally fitted the right stone. She could see it. The trembling at the edges of the gold was smoothing out. The notation she had been watching shake for weeks was settling. The settling reached the central anchor. For 1 second, the chamber was perfectly still. Then the air went tight, and then a wave of energy moved up through the stone and through the ceiling and outward in every direction. Theodore, who had been standing at the wall behind her, closed the distance in 2 steps and shielded her body with his own as the chamber's lamps flared. The wave crested. Wind moved past them in the small chamber, and there was nowhere for the wind to be coming from. The mithril of the circle glowed brighter than it ever had. Not gold, but white gold, brief and almost unbearable. Then it dimmed back to gold. The chamber went quiet. The wind stopped. The lamps came back. Alice opened her eyes. The notation had locked into place. The circle was running cleanly. She could feel it in the air, the way she had felt the first wrongness in it weeks ago. Except now, there was no wrongness. Only a steady, deep-drawn breath of magic that did not stutter and did not need her to keep watching it. She sat back on her heels. Theodore was still standing close. She turned her head and looked up at him. "We did it," she said. "You did it." She lifted one ink-stained hand and held it out, knuckles up. Theodore tapped his knuckles against hers, twice. The second tap had the small extra weight of a thing being acknowledged that did not have a public name yet. She started laughing, not loudly, just the small surprised laugh of a person who had finished a piece of work she had been carrying for weeks and discovered that the work had let her go cleanly. Theodore laughed too, briefly. They sat at the edge of the working circle for a minute without speaking, and the chamber kept its new steady gold light. And somewhere a great distance above them, the energy wave was moving outward through the air at the speed of magic. Above ground, the wave found everyone in the settlement at the same moment. Grant was in the forge. He had been hammering the inscription channel of a new tool, a chisel with a small magic edge, and his arm was halfway down through the swing when the wave passed through the building. He felt it on his skin first. He stopped the swing. The hammer hung in his hand at the height where it had stopped. He did not move it for several seconds. The forge fire kept burning in the pit beside him. He did not look at the fire. He looked at the stone wall of the forge because the air against the wall had changed in a way he could not name. He set the hammer down very carefully on the bench. He did not pick it up again for some time. Millie was in the small inner garden behind the building, bare feet in the dirt, holding her rabbit plushie under one arm and helping the chief's wife pull weeds from the spring beans. She straightened up. She looked toward the southern wall. She looked at her rabbit. She held the rabbit a little tighter. The chief's wife, kneeling in the row beside her, looked up at the same moment, and the two of them stayed there for several seconds with weeds in their hands and the question of what had just changed sitting between them. Owen was at the back gate. He had been carrying a cartload of firewood through. The cartwheel made one more revolution and stopped. Owen looked up. The trees inside the barrier were not moving in any wind. Owen could not have said what he had just felt. He stayed where he was. Across the inner courtyard, a man cleaning a window stopped wiping. A woman feeding chickens stopped feeding. Two children chasing a ball stopped running. The settlement, for a span of perhaps 10 seconds, was a place where every adult and every child had simultaneously paused at exactly the same instant for reasons no one of them could have named. Then, the wave passed completely. The air settled. The forge fire kept burning. The wind in the canopy resumed. The children remembered the ball. The settlement went on with its afternoon as if a thing had not just happened, but the air felt cleaner. The light felt cleaner. The barrier above them was different, and they did not know yet how different, but every person in the settlement had felt, for that brief still moment, that they had been, all of them, made safer. That evening, Victoria called the meeting, 6 of them around the wooden table. Alice with her ink-stained fingers and the small, tired smile of someone who had finally slept enough. Theodore at her left shoulder, quiet, hands folded on the wood. Victoria across from her in the seat she always took. Owen to Victoria's right. Fred and Emma further down, both of them showing in their faces the expression of people who knew something significant had happened that afternoon and had not yet been told what. Alice gave her report. She kept it factual. The barrier circle had been repaired. The repair had restored the original specifications of the mechanism, which she had not previously had complete information about. As a consequence, the barrier now operated according to its full design parameters. She paused. She looked at Victoria. Then she gave them the numbers. The barrier's exclusion radius, the distance from the castle within which it repelled non-human creatures with hostile intent, had returned to the area the original builders had specified. That area was approximately 100 times the area Victoria's settlement had been protecting up until this morning. Fred sat up straight. "What?" he said. 100 times? Alice nodded. She gave the second number. The barrier, drawing its power from the geological connection she had discovered on the reverse face of the circle, now operated on a self-sustaining basis. With the connection notation properly aligned, it required no further maintenance. Its working life, provided no fundamental disruption occurred during the first 3-month settling period, was approximately 1 century. Owen, who had not spoken once, set down the cup he had been holding. He looked at Victoria. Emma, after a moment, asked the question she always asked, in the low voice of a person who could not quite trust the data. Expanded. By how much? 100 times the prior area, approximately. And lasting 100 years. Victoria did not move for a long time. Her hands, which had been folded on the table, slowly turned palms up in her lap. She closed them around nothing. She opened them again. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had been carrying a weight for 8 years and had been carrying it well, and who had just found out, across one quiet minute in a small room, that she could put it down. "Alice," she said at last, in a voice that had to be steady because the alternative was unprofessional. "Thank you." Alice looked down at the table. She mumbled something about having had fun analyzing the circle. Theodore, beside her, made a small breath that might have been a laugh and might have been pride. Fred recovered enough to start asking practical questions. The barrier excluded hostile non-human presence. Did it exclude hostile humans? Alice answered, no. The mechanism was specifically calibrated to non-human signatures. Hostile humans could still walk in. Fred nodded, filed it. Emma, recovering, asked whether the children could now safely play in the inner band of the new perimeter, the area the barrier had not previously covered. Alice said yes, after the 3-month observation period confirmed stability. Owen said, very quietly, the children would be very glad. Victoria, who had recovered her court voice, but had not yet recovered the lightness she usually carried in it, asked Alice if she would consent to spend the 3 monitoring months at the settlement. Alice said yes without consulting Theodore. Theodore did not need to be consulted. He had already known the answer. The meeting drifted, after that, into practical planning. Owen and Fred would lead a forest survey to map the new exterior boundary. Emma would coordinate the children's schedule. Theodore would help with the survey on his off-duty days. Alice would be available for anything anyone needed her to look at. When the others rose, Victoria asked Alice to stay back for a moment, alone. Alice looked at Theodore. Theodore stood, nodded once at Victoria, touched Alice's shoulder, and left with the others. What Victoria asked Alice in that private conversation belongs to the next phase. For now, the meeting closed. The lamp on the table burned a little lower. Outside the upstairs window, the children of the settlement were still playing in the courtyard, the long evening light extending what was, in this castle, a moment that would now be safe for 100 years. Alice went up to the wall alone before she went to bed. The wall was empty at this hour. The watchman had completed his round and was on the other side of the courtyard. The night was cold and still, and the sky over the canopy was the kind of full clear black that the kingdom's capital, with its city lanterns and its ambient smoke, never showed. Alice walked along the wall to the place where she had stood with Grant on the evening she had first seen the dragon, and she sat down with her back against the stone. She did not think about Janet. She did not think about the king or the queen or the institute. She did not think, even briefly, about how she had, that afternoon, done a piece of work that would expose the people who had stolen her research as people who could not produce its results. She thought about Victor. The last research he had asked her to take seriously was a wide area barrier magic, designed to reduce the suffering of war. He had built it because his homeland had been burned. He had wanted more than the credit for the magic to exist. He had died before it was finished, and Alice had finished it alone, and Janet had stolen it because the king had wanted it for a war Victor would have hated. The barrier Janet had stolen was a wide area surface storage barrier. 3 mages, 14 days, calculated for a specific area. It was elegant. It was clever. It was a thing built within the limitations of how modern researchers thought about barrier magic. The barrier Alice had repaired today drew from the earth. The two were not the same kind of magic at all. The Institute could try to replicate Alice's surface storage paper for the rest of the year, and they would never produce, by accident or by skill, the kind of result Alice had built today. Because the kind of result Alice had built today required understanding that magic could be drawn from geology. And that knowledge was on a page in Alice's head that the Institute did not have. The theft would not matter. Not because she would expose it, and not because Janet would confess, but because what cannot be replicated cannot be claimed by people who do not understand it. The kingdom's plans for invading the Lumina Kingdom rested on a barrier the Institute could not build. The plans would not unfold the way the king had imagined they would. Whether Alice did anything at all, the lie at the center of the Institute would gradually starve. Victor would have been quietly satisfied with that, she thought. She sat for a while longer. The stars moved slightly. The barrier, somewhere 100 times wider than it had been this morning, kept on running. The dragon would come back next month, and the dragon's roar would no longer matter. The new mechanism was no longer vulnerable to that resonance. A small thought came to her without invitation. The day she had walked out of the audience hall with the Lord's ring on her right index finger had been, by the kingdom's intent, the worst day of her life. A disposal disguised as a reward. Tonight, sitting on the wall of a settlement the kingdom did not know about, with the barrier above her humming back to its full design, she could see the day from a different angle. She had been thrown away. The throw had landed her exactly here. The land the king had given her as a punishment was the only place in the world where the work she had wanted to do all her life could be finished. She did not call this gratitude. She did not owe the king any gratitude. She called it, in the quiet of her own head, accuracy. She got up. She went down from the wall. She slept. Alice came back to the meeting room in the morning, the way Victoria had asked. The room had been cleared of the previous evening's tea service. The chairs had been straightened. Victoria was already seated when Alice and Theodore arrived. Owen stood at his customary place at her left shoulder. The light through the small window was the pale kind of morning light that does not reach into a room's corners, and the corners of this room held a quiet that had not been there yesterday. Victoria rose when Alice entered. She did not rise the way she had risen for ordinary visitors before. She rose in a slow, careful motion that had been taught to her in some other life and had been carried across 8 years, and now was being used for the first time in a long time. She stood. She faced Alice across the table. She placed her hands at her sides. She bowed. The bow was not deep. It was the bow of a person of her station to a person of equal station, performed with the precision of someone who had grown up in a court where a quarter inch of wrongness in a bow was a punishable offense. Owen, behind her, bowed as well. Alice did not know what to do. She glanced at Theodore. Theodore was standing very still beside her, with his eyes on Victoria. Victoria straightened. She took a small breath. She spoke in the formal register Alice had heard her use only once before, when she had asked 8 days ago that Alice repair the swords. Lady Alice, I would like to ask you, as the Lord of the territory of Valmore, for permission for myself and my people to remain on this land. The room held still. Victoria continued. She acknowledged that the territory was Alice's by royal decree. She acknowledged that she and her people had occupied the territory for 8 years without authorization, having been placed here by an order whose legal force she now considered ambiguous. She wished to make the arrangement formal, to the extent that anything between the two of them could be considered formal under the kingdom's law. She was asking Alice for permission. She would understand if Alice required time to consider. Alice did not require time. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She tried again. Yes, she said. Stay. Victoria's composure held. The relief showed only as a small movement at the corner of her eyes, a softening Alice would not have caught 2 months ago. Theodore, beside Alice, made a small breath that was almost a laugh. He leaned in slightly and spoke quietly. Alice, you are still the Lord. The kingdom legally maintains a missing lord's authority for 3 years from disappearance, so your yes is valid. Alice nodded. She said it again, more carefully. Yes, I would like you and your people to stay. This is your home. I am glad you are here. She did not say it well. She did not say it formally. She said it the way she said everything, which was plainly. Victoria smiled, properly, for the first time since the bow. Owen relaxed his shoulders. The conversation that followed was practical. 3 months of barrier observation. The expansion would need surveying. The 4 side rooms underground might contain answers Alice would investigate slowly. Theodore would assist with patrols. Alice would be available for any technical question that came up. The settlement would continue as it had, with the small structural difference that the Lord of Valmore had now formally acknowledged its right to exist. When they rose to leave, Victoria stopped Alice with a small gesture and added one more sentence, in the casual tone of a woman delivering a fact she had been carrying for a while. You are welcome here, not as the Lord, as Alice. Alice did not have an answer for that. She nodded. She left the room with Theodore beside her. She walked down the stair into the courtyard with the light around her shoulders. That night, she slept the kind of sleep she had not slept in years. The dream was simple. She was standing in a place that was not any place she had been to, somewhere with a long view and a quiet sky. And Victor was standing at a small distance from her with a small smile on his face. He was wearing the white researcher's coat he had always worn. He was older than the last time she had seen him, but he was not unwell. He was looking directly at her. He was speaking. His mouth was moving. The words did not reach her. She did not need them to. She knew what he was saying the way one knows the shape of an answer before the answer arrives. He was saying something about the work. He was saying something about her. He was saying something that she would have have repeated in his voice if she had been able to hear it. She watched his face. He was not asking anything of her. He was just letting her see that he had seen. Then the dream ended. She woke in her bed. The light through the window was the very first gray of dawn. She did not move for a few minutes. Her face was a little wet. She wiped it. She lay there with the dream still warm against her chest and discovered that what had been very heavy in her for a long time was now lighter. The work was done. He had seen it. The dream had shown her what she could not have shown herself. She got up. She dressed. She went down the stairs to the kitchen, where the chief's wife was already up putting the bread out, and she ate breakfast at the long communal table while the morning came up properly through the windows. Theodore came down a little later, set his hand on her shoulder briefly in passing, and went to join the patrol assembly at the back gate. Alice ate her bread. She drank her tea. She watched the sun fill the courtyard. The day was beginning. The barrier was holding. The settlement was hers. In a way it would not have been if she had not chosen to say yes. She stood up to go check on the underground circle. She noticed as she walked that the Lord's ring on her right index finger had stopped feeling too big. In the kingdom's territory, far away on the other side of the forest, two men had been searching for a long time. They had entered the demon forest from the Khazre side a week earlier. The black-clad advisor's instructions had been clear: confirm or refute the presumed dead conclusion on the missing senior knight and the missing magic researcher. They had been chosen for the work because they had done this kind of work before. The long-haired one used earth magic, earth spears, earth arrows, anchored from a small dark staff. The short-haired one used a magic sword and a temper that had been useful in many rooms. They had killed 30 wolf types and 4 large bears in the last 3 days. They had not found a body. They had not found a piece of clothing. They had not found a discarded bag or a broken bottle or a single recognizable trace of any human passing through this part of the forest in any recent period of time. The long-haired one had a theory. 8 years ago, when an entirely different kind of person had been sent into this forest to handle an entirely different kind of problem, almost no remains had been found then either. The forest did not leave remains. The forest absorbed what entered it. The short-haired one cleaned blood off his blade and looked at the canopy and asked, with genuine professional irritation, how many more days they were supposed to do this. A few more, the long-haired one said. Then they would leave the item the advisor had given them and return to the village. What item? The short-haired one asked. A device, the long-haired one said. A small thing, buried at a particular spot. The advisor had not explained its purpose. They had been instructed to bury it, mark the spot, and walk away. The short-haired one filed this. He did not ask further. They went back to fighting whatever the forest sent at them next. 3 days later, they walked back into Khazre village. The village chief saw them coming up the road and went pale. He had been waiting for some news. He had been hoping for some news. The wife had asked him every evening whether the 2 men in black had returned, and every evening he had said no. This evening, he would have to say yes. He met them at the edge of the village square. The long-haired one smiled at him. The smile was the smile of a man who had practiced it. The short-haired one stood a step behind. Together, they looked exactly like men who had completed a search. The long-haired one explained, with the careful sympathy of someone reciting a script, that the news he had to deliver was unfortunately the news he had expected to deliver. The senior knight and the magic researcher had not been found. The forest had been searched as thoroughly as could be managed by 2 trained operatives. No remains had been recovered. No personal items had been found. The forest at this depth and density did not, the long-haired one explained, give such things back. His professional opinion, with great regret, was that the pair had not survived their entry into the deep forest. They were almost certainly dead. The kingdom would file this conclusion with the appropriate authority in due course. He asked with a small added kindness that was not real, that the village chief send word to the capital if anyone matching the description ever came out of the forest in the future, as a courtesy. The village chief bowed deeply. He thanked the men for their service. He asked if they would stay in the village for the night before returning. They would not, the long-haired one said. They had what they needed. They would walk back to the road tonight. The 2 men turned and left. Halfway down the road, where they could not be seen from the village, they stepped off the path. The long-haired one took out a small black device, a metal object the size of a closed fist with a single rune scratched into its top, and pressed his thumb to the rune. The rune lit briefly. He buried the device in the soft earth at the base of a marked tree. He brushed leaves over the spot. The short-haired one watched. He did not ask what the device did. They walked the rest of the way to the road. They left. The kingdom's official file on researcher Alice Brick and senior knight Theodore was, the next morning, formally updated to read: presumed deceased in the demon forest, killed by monsters, the matter closed. The king's council met that same week. The chamber was the smaller council room, not the great audience hall where Alice had been given the territory, but the king's working chamber, where the actual machinery of the kingdom was decided. The king sat at the head of a long, polished table. Defense Minister Ferguson, the queen's father, the duke who had given the kingdom its current shape, sat at his right. The other ministers ranged down the table, each in his place. Ferguson delivered the day's defense report. Troop strength had passed 50,000 for the first time in the kingdom's history. The 4 border forts in the western waste were under construction on schedule. The Wide Area Barrier Program, the program that depended on the magic researcher Alice Brick had developed, though no one in the room used her name, was in operational testing. The king listened. The king asked, with the dry precision of a man whose memory was excellent, for the most recent test result. Ferguson cleared his throat. He delivered the number. With 5 to 6 mages rotating, the Institute had produced a wide area barrier sustained for 7 days at the test fort. The king did not move. The king said, without raising his voice, the original report on the magic stipulated 3 mages for 14 days. The numbers Ferguson had just delivered did not match. The king did not believe he was hearing things. He was waiting for an explanation. Ferguson explained that the Institute had encountered some replication challenges in scaling the magic to operational conditions. Director Janet was personally working on the issue. The numbers would be brought in line with the original specification before the campaign timetable required them. The king did not blink. The king pointed out that the campaign timetable required them in 8 months. The king pointed out that the Institute had already had 4 months to bring the numbers in line. The king asked whether Director Janet was making progress. Ferguson said that progress was being made, but slowly. The king said that progress would have to be made faster. The king asked the next question. Could the existing mithril supply, in any case, equip all 4 forts with the wide area barrier? Ferguson said it could not. Mithril was scarce in the western quarry. To equip all 4 forts, even at the Institute's current performance, would take 10 years, possibly longer. The king turned to the finance minister. The finance minister, a careful older man who had been balancing the kingdom's books for 2 decades, said cautiously that the population had been heavily taxed for 3 consecutive years, and that further increases would cause problems. The agricultural minister added that the year's wheat harvest had been weak. An additional tax would push the western villages into hardship. The king said that the kingdom's military expansion required mithril. The kingdom's mithril supply required money. The money required taxes. The campaign required the barrier. The barrier required mithril. The mithril required the taxes. He instituted a 10% increase in the mithril levy effective immediately. He dismissed the objections without raising his voice. He turned the meeting to the next item on the agenda. The finance minister did not look up from the table. The agriculture minister did not look up. Ferguson did not look up. Across the table, no one looked up. What none of them said, what could not be said in this room, was that the entire structure of the kingdom's military expansion was now anchored in a piece of magic the Institute could not replicate to the standard the king believed it would be replicated to. The king was issuing taxes to fund a campaign that depended on a barrier that did not exist at the scale required. The Institute had been 4 months on the problem. The Institute would be 4 years on the problem. The barrier the king was paying for would, at the Institute's current rate, never be produced. The king did not know this. The king believed the Institute would solve it. The king's belief was the foundation under the rest of the chamber's silence. The meeting concluded. The ministers filed out. Ferguson remained behind for a moment. He did not move from his chair until the chamber was empty. Then he stood. Then he walked. Ferguson did not sit down when he reached his own office. He stood at the window with his back to his desk. His secretary stood at the doorway and waited for an order. The order was brief and quiet. Ferguson told the secretary to ride immediately to the Magic Research Institute and deliver a verbal message to Director Janet. The message was, produce a wide area barrier matching the original paper's specifications within the month. No excuses, no explanations, no further reports until the result was achieved. Director Janet's family connections did not extend to a future in which she failed to deliver. The secretary repeated the message back. He bowed, he left. Ferguson stayed at the window. He watched the courtyard below. Janet was the queen's niece. Janet had stolen Alice Brick's research. Janet had used the Ferguson family's influence to expel the researcher from the Institute within 3 days. Janet had assured the family that the research would be operational under her direction within the year. Janet had been wrong repeatedly for 4 months. Ferguson knew exactly what was about to happen if Janet did not produce the result, and he had just delivered to Janet, through his secretary, the exact form of that knowledge. The narrator notes only this: Janet would receive the message that afternoon. Janet would order more mages. Janet would order another mithril shipment. Janet would still produce the same result, because the research she had stolen was a paper, and the magic Alice Brick had built was something a paper could not contain. The kingdom had built its expansion on a foundation it did not own. The arc closes. In the capital, Janet sits in a director's chair she does not understand the work of. The barrier she signed her name to fails for the 11th consecutive test. Ferguson stands at his window. The king is in his chambers and does not yet know the extent of the wrongness in his own ministry's reports. In Cosray Village, the chief sits at his table with his wife and tells her, with great care, knowing the words might not be entirely safe, that the 2 men in black have left and that he hopes Alice and Theodore are somewhere safer than where the men in black thought they were. In the Queen's tea salon, a tea service is cleared away. The hunt for the missing researcher has been formally closed. In a forest the kingdom does not know is now 100 times safer than it was 3 months ago. A small woman with ink-stained hands stands on a castle wall watching the sun come up. The Lord's ring on her right index finger has stopped feeling too big. The barrier above her runs steady. Her father's work is done. She walks back down to her room. She begins her morning. There's a great deal of research still to do, and the rest of her life to do it in, and she has, for the first time since the ceremony in the audience hall, the right place in which to do it. The first arc of her story ends here. The next has already begun.